live.
Recording in
Welcome,
progress.
everyone. Today is Thursday, November 30th. It's 7:03 p.m. I'd like to call this meeting to order of the Committee of the Whole of our Confirmation of Appointments and Personnel Matters Committee meeting. I'm Judy Pineda-Neufeld. I'm your Ward 7 counselor and the chair of this committee. Pursuant to Chapter 2 of the Acts of 2023, this meeting of a City Council Committee will be conducted via remote participation, hybrid. We will post an audio recording, audio-video recording, transcript, or other comprehensive record of these proceedings as soon as possible after the meeting on the City of Somerville website and local cable access government channels. With that, Mr. Clerk, can we call roll to establish quorum, please?
Yes. Councilor McLaughlin. Councilor Davis. Councilor Scott.
Present.
Councilor Strezzo.
Present.
Councilor Klingon.
Present.
Councilor Wilson.
Present.
Councilor Burnley.
Present.
Councilor Gomez-Moacad.
Present.
Councilor Kelly.
Present.
Councilor Ewan-Campen. Here. Chair Pineda-Neufeld.
Here.
With 2 absent, we have a quorum.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mr. Clerk. Can we move on to the committee minutes?
Item number 1, committee meeting minutes. ID number 23-1648, approval review. Approval of the minutes of the Confirmation of Appointments and Personnel Matters Committee meeting of November 1st, 2023.
Any discussion? Okay, that item's approved. I think we don't have anyone remote. Great. We're going to take the next 2 items up together. So, Mr. Clerk, do you mind reading those out?
Not at all. Item 2, Officers Communication, ID number 23-1734, sent for discussion. Director of the Department of Racial and Social Justice conveying the Police Department Staffing and Operations Analysis. Item number 3, Order ID number 22-1844, sent for discussion by Councilor Gomez-Moacad that the Director of Racial and Social Justice provide an update on the police staffing report.
Wonderful. So these are basically the same items. So we have 2 of our consultants with us tonight from Raftelis. We have Jonathan Ingram, who's a senior manager, and Cassandra Deck-Brown, our principal consultant. They'll present out the police department staffing and operations analysis report. I ask you all to hold questions to the end, and then we'll open it up to questions from the entire council. So with that, I invite Raftelis to join us, and Director Melina Capers, are you joining us as well? Wonderful. And Chief Femino, okay.
Good evening, Honorable City Council. I'm very excited to sit here with you this evening once again. Good evening, members of the community, city department heads, and staff, through the chair. I would like to express my sincere gratitude to the many people who collaborated on this staffing and operations analysis, including Somerstat, community stakeholders, and especially the Somerville Police Department. This project started in 2021 and was undertaken with the intention of it playing a part in providing a full understanding of our community's public safety needs, current Somerville Police Department resources, and information about where public safety for all considerations can be made. Raftelis is a consulting firm with over 28 years of experience working with local governments and utilities. Public safety analysis is among their municipal specialties, and they have worked with 38 of the country's 50 largest cities. In March of 2022, we contracted Raftelis Financial Consultants to conduct a staffing and operations analysis of the Somerville Police Department as part of RSJ's ongoing work surrounding public safety for all. Last Tuesday, on November 21st, we presented the preliminary findings from the Public Safety for All survey. For next steps, RSJ will continue to present key findings and policy recommendations in early 2024 as part of the city's Public Safety for All initiative. RSJ will present reports from the Civilian Oversight Task Force, the Anti-Violence Working Group, and the Public Safety for All Task Force, as well as the aforementioned Public Safety for All report. Now, I'm excited to welcome and honored to present Jonathan Ingram, Senior Manager, and Principal Consultant Cassandra Deck-Brown, Law Enforcement Subject Matter Expert, from Raftelis to present their findings from the SPD Staffing and Operations Analysis. Our Chief of Police, Charles Femino, and myself will be present for any questions from City Council as well. I now hand over the mic.
I hold it? No, we're good, okay. Good evening, honorable councilors. Very good to be with you this evening. I guess Denise mentioned, my name is Jonathan Ingram. I'm a senior manager with Raftelis. Give you a sense of what we want to try to cover today. We'll do some introductions, just give you a sense of who we are and what our background is as individuals. Cassandra and I were the primary consultants during the assessment process. So we'll give you just a little bit of sense of who we are. I want to spend some time talking about our process, our analytical process, and how it integrates with the broader kind of program and plans relevant to the Department of Racial and Social Justice. And then I want to hit really what our key findings and recommendations are. So we'll go through a PowerPoint that hits the high points, but we'll really focus on trying to give you some context behind some of the analysis and recommendations that we've made, give you some sense of what we would feel would be appropriate in terms of a course of action going forward in terms of prioritization as well as we move through, and of course give you all at the end of the conversation an opportunity to just share any questions you may have or any comments you may have, and we'd be happy to respond as we move along. So just a little bit about myself. I've been doing this for about 20 years. My background is in general city management and analytical work. Okay, so we are very intentional about how we create our project teams at Raftelis and in the public safety space. We pair folks with general city management expertise and analytical expertise, that's me, with folks who have background and experience doing the work day in, running police departments, running fire departments, finance departments, those kinds of things. And that is Cassandra. I have managed over 80 of these types of processes across the country, developed most of our analytical methodologies relevant to policing, both on the investigative side, the patrol side, as well as the support services and admin side. Departments as small as Chesterfield, Massachusetts, where occasionally the police chief jumps off a tractor to respond to a call, to communities as large as Aurora, Colorado, where over 100 languages are spoken, and just about every type of complexity in between. So quite a bit of experience in this space. As I mentioned, we pair our teams really very intentionally. My role is kind of on the analytical side and connecting the function and role of a department with the broader city management perspective. So my primary focus is prove it. So we want to dive into data, both qualitative and quantitative data, to inform any recommendations we have. Whereas Cassandra, and I'll ask Cassandra to share a little bit about her background, make sure that the data makes practical sense within the realm of what it takes to actually deliver the service to our residents, to the public, on a day in, day out basis. Cassandra?
Good evening, everyone. It's an honor to be here and present before you as well. I am Cassandra Deck-Brown. I'm retired police chief. Served in the city of Raleigh for the entire course of my career. That's 34 years from recruit to chief. Raleigh is the capital city and the 41st largest city in the nation. Led that department the last 8 years as chief through both the pandemic as well as protest. And as a capital city, it is unique in a lot of ways because it's a legislative hub. There's always a protest, there's always a rally, and being the second largest municipality in the state of North Carolina, resources were always to bear. I've had the honor and privilege to be on the requesting client side of these types of studies as well. And I've experienced very great beneficial studies, and I've experienced some that really did not afford us to move forward. And now I have the privilege to be on the other side, the consulting side of a study, where I do hope that you will find benefit, use, practicality in this report itself. And so once again, thank you for allowing us to be a part of this process. Thank you.
Okay. So before we kind of move into some of the details and give you a sense of the project, I want to just set the context. I think one of the challenges that everyone is aware of is in the policing space nationally. There is increased scrutiny of police departments for justifiable reasons, and there is a growing demand in our communities to engender more transparency, to better connect police departments with the communities they serve, and to create an environment that focuses on public safety and eliminates incidences of bias in policing, incidences of violence, and creates essentially a partnership between the community and the police department. There were varying voices on both sides of that argument. There are varying voices in that conversation, in that national conversation in this room, I'm sure, based on having conversations with many of you, and in your community. I think the public safety survey results that were shared with you all about a week ago really highlighted some of the really good things, I think, in the community, but also some challenges that you all need to be and are intentional about addressing. Our focus with this process is to really help kind of bridge the narrative and identify what can the police department do from a structural perspective, from a focus perspective, from a community service perspective, to better integrate and align with the community's values and the community's expectations. So that's fundamentally the philosophy and the approach that underpinned the process for us and that underpins, frankly, all of our work. How do we connect communities and the departments that serve them? Okay. Next slide, please. So how does that kind of mesh in with the overall framework? So we have a small piece, as was previously mentioned, of a broader public safety initiative. Our particular task, next slide please, was to really dive in and complete an organizational assessment of the Somerville Police Department that focused very heavily on staffing levels, everything from do we have the right positions, are the positions in the right place, do we have the right balance of sworn to civilian, and what do we need to do to make sure that we are equipped to respond to fundamental quality of life and public safety issues in the community while creating a strong sense of trust and positive relationship with the community. That was fundamentally what our task was. Next slide, please. Now, our process, what we call our 6R engagement, I want to just give you a sense of generally what our approach is so you have an idea of how we approach it. So fundamentally, our baseline, our beginning sort of portion of this type of work is to really engage in both quantitative and qualitative analysis. The first thing that we do in this work is we seek to understand the context of the community. All right? So we spend a lot of time talking with officers at every level of the organization to gather their perspectives. We speak with members of the governing body. When it's built into the scope, we will often speak with members of the public, although this particular project was done in alignment and concurrently with a broader, much more rigorous public engagement effort that the Department of Social Justice engaged in and that you received some preliminary results on not long ago. So our task was really to look at the organization in the department so that you have something to compare and hold up against with that community perspective. So we spent a lot of time in conversations just understanding the baseline, independent of any judgment about what's right or what's wrong, okay? And we want to understand of all the responsibilities that you were tasked with. So what does the community expect of you? What are the legal requirements? Every community in Massachusetts, and frankly every community in the United States, as a home rule community, is tasked with providing and enforcing laws. That has to be done one way or another, either through the establishment and maintenance of your own department or through fundamentally the outsourcing of that work to a county operation or for a state operation, right? So fundamentally, it is your task as a governing body to determine the best course forward in that space. What we have really focused on is, what are the requirements of that, and how do we best align that approach with your all's individual community priorities, right? To give you all the authority and responsibility to be able to do that. We then look at what are the outcomes. So based on the resources that you have available, the people, the tools, the community resources, the partnerships, what are the results that are ultimately generated? So how well are you doing meeting that community's expectations from their perspective, from your perspective? How does that compare, the results that you all are producing, to best practices in the policing space in 21st century policing? And what's the gap? And fundamentally, looking at that gap is what drives what our recommendations are, right? So that qualitative analysis, the quantitative analysis, and really trying to bridge the gap between that community expectation of service and the practical practical constraints of policing and enforcing the law in a community, right? So what's the balance there? And that really informs our recommendations. Our recommendations are really intentionally designed to be actionable, okay? Each of us has served for local governments. We've all sat in your seats in one capacity or another. Implementation is our focus, and it is our bias. We're not going to give you 75 recommendations that don't make any sense and that you can't execute. We're not going to ask you to go change legislation at the Commonwealth level, right? We want to give you recommendations that you can carry forward, and ultimately that's what we've offered. Our final deliverable, really after this process, will be an implementation plan, okay? That implementation plan will provide each of the recommendations, what we view as the priority, as well as key implementation steps and a broad timeline. Now, we provide that as a draft implementation plan, okay? And we do not provide a final, we provide a draft, because it's intended to be a living document that you all can use as a municipality to track and manage the implementation, to adjust based on changing environmental conditions, based on changing priorities, which will inevitably happen. Ultimately, what we have offered are recommendations. You may choose to implement some of them, all of them, or none of them as a community, right? That's completely valid and completely legitimate. We want to give you the flexibility to carry this forward and be responsible to your community. Next slide, please. In terms of some of the specific things that we did relevant to this particular scope of work, we interviewed about 27 department staff, either individually or in focus groups. That includes folks at every level of the organization, sworn, civilians, supervisors, frontline, and individual contributors. We also extended invitations to interview everyone on the governing body, and we're fortunate enough to interview 7 folks, 7 city councilors. We also spent a lot of time doing a ride-along, frankly, and a community tour. This is something that we try to pair with any time we're diving into calls for service data. They can tell one story, right? The data on a flat screen can tell one story, but driving through this community, its density, understanding and feeling and experiences its density, traffic patterns, some of the challenges you all have around rush hour, for example, provides really important context as we're looking at the data, right? So that's really the difference between the qualitative and the quantitative, understanding the sense of place and integrating that with what the data tells us. We then moved through a process of really starting to digest everything that we learned through that fact-finding process and through that analytical process. So start to frame initial observations and recommendations, to start to fine-tune our analysis to make sure that the data is as clean as possible, and if we can't find clean data, to be very clear about that, right? So a very intentional process to ultimately work to a place where we can give you a draft report, a project report, which you all have before you today. So that just high level is our process and sort of the process that we went through. Next, I'd like to just spend some time talking about some of our key findings and recommendations. So, as I mentioned, I'm not going to go through each of the recommendations in absolute detail, although we'll hit most of them. The important thing here is really to try to convey to you some of the key themes and context that we've recommended in the report. I think each of you has had an opportunity to at least hold the report, and we'll have some opportunity to kind of dive into it in some detail as the weeks go by. But I want to highlight first just a few general observations. Next slide, please. One more. Oh, there it is. Thank you. So just a few things that I think many of you will know. There's a few sort of operating conditions that I think are really important to emphasize. One, you all have a very dense population. You're one of the densest communities in the United States, which all of you know, and I think is probably either both a source of pride and a source of frustration, depending on the hour of the day, maybe. But this can present some really fundamental challenges in terms of law enforcement, right? So response patterns, traffic patterns, those things have a fundamental impact on the ability to quickly respond to emergency incidents and drive to some degree what your patrol beat structure ought to look like, right, and the availability of individual officers. You also are anticipating some pretty significant population growth. That density is only expected to expand. You're anticipating, commercial and transit centers, which are going to be more workers to the community, more residents in the community, and that will have a fundamental impact on really every city service, including policing. Now, one of the things that I want to emphasize here is, we've completed an assessment that's really a snapshot in time, okay? We've identified your workload patterns, identified some trends that you can take into account, but as your community grows, what we've really offered are key indicators, key metrics that you all can pay attention to, so that as the community grows, as the dynamic changes, you will have the tools at your disposal to look at the data and say, how is this impacting us, and at what point do we need to start thinking about further adjustments in our staffing, right? So, because the type of development, the type of population growth that can occur in a community will have fundamentally different impacts on what the ultimate impact is. A residential community, for example, has one impact, a commercial center has another, a multifamily property has another, right? Those all have different levers that you pull. So what we've tried to identify are some metrics that you can kind of pay attention to there. There's also, a lot of varying opinions about what the role of police ought to be in the community. There are varying opinions, as I mentioned, I think in this room, based on some of the conversations that we've had. The public safety survey results certainly indicate some varying perspectives about what the expectations and what the hopes are. There's a natural tension there, and it's the role of the police department and the role in the city to try to seek equilibrium in that space, right? And what we've really done is try to outline some fundamental recommendations in terms of community engagement, in terms of focus, in terms of what building trust in communities looks like from a best practice perspective. We've added a number of recommendations, which we'll touch on later in that space. Next slide, please. There's also, a couple really good things that I think I want to highlight as well. So the fact that the police department is accredited is a very good thing. It requires a lot of effort and a lot of time to maintain that accreditation, but the real value of accreditation is it ensures that the most up-to-date policies from a national, from a state, from a best practice perspective are continuously being evaluated against the individual policies and processes within the department. So it's a built-in mechanism, a built-in enforced review process to make sure that there's advantage there. And I think when we really look at a lot of the policies that are in place, I think, and especially some of the programs like CORE, right? There's some fundamental best practices that I think could be modeled in other communities, and that's something to be really proud of, both for the department and for the community, and potentially expanded upon when you consider how best to evolve and enhance alternative forms of policing. There was, extensive collaboration with the Department of Racial and Social Justice for some enhanced engagement. So that engagement process that you all have undertaken over the past couple of years at this point is an incredibly great place to start, to continue in a process of building and strengthening relationships between the department and the community and aligning the department with the needs and service level expectations of that community. But there are some fundamental challenges, right? This environment that is embedded with some tension nationally and locally has created some challenges from a morale perspective. Officers are very connected with each other. They are very committed to serving the community. That came out and rang loud and clear. But there's also some broad perception of feeling unsupported by segments of the community and the governing body, and that is a challenge. That's a challenge to be aware of and to be intentionally managed against. Next slide, please. So next I'd like to talk just quickly about command structure. So not a whole lot to cover here except to emphasize a couple of things. So when we look at command structure, we look at really a few different things. One, we look at supervisory spans of control and kind of program areas. So based on the number of programs that you have, based on the scope of work that the department is engaged in, is there a need to create or consolidate command level positions to ultimately facilitate service delivery to the community? We have made recommendations, which we'll talk about later, around reallocating line level positions, reallocating some supervisory positions, but fundamentally looking at the command structure, we've not made any fundamental recommendations around changing that command structure. So I just wanted to have a slide in here just to emphasize that piece. The next area that I'd like to talk about is patrol staffing. Let's not advance the slide just yet. So just in terms of some context, so patrol is the largest area of any police department. It is the leading edge of response to the public. It is typically patrol officers who are dealing with folks in what is often the worst day of an individual's life, right? The role of the patrol function in terms of perceptions and experience of public safety and quality of life in the community is critical, all right? It's also the area with the largest number of personnel typically, the largest number of sworn personnel, and they're your first responders to most significant incidents. When we look at patrol staffing, there are kind of philosophical approaches, and one of the things that we'll emphasize is there's a need to really define a policy preference in this community. What you look for from a best practice perspective is a patrol function and an organization at large that is engaged with the community, that provides effective relationship building, and that has the capacity to provide proactive, intelligent, preventative measures that are thoughtful and that focus on building trust and relationships, and also preventing crime and addressing crime patterns in a significant and thoughtful way. So fundamentally, from a best practice perspective, we are looking at how do we create appropriate capacity for patrol officers to spend time getting to know the community, engaging with the community, getting out of their vehicles, building relationships, and ultimately strengthening trust and strengthening their ability to respond to crime when it occurs, okay? There are a number of best practices in this space, but fundamentally, we've built a model that assumes, and this is the underlying model of our staffing analysis on the patrol side, that about a third of an officer's time ought to be available for proactive policing, a third available for responding to calls for service, that's reactive policing. So when someone calls 911 and they dispatch an officer, that's a reactive call, okay? And then the administrative time, which is an ever-increasing burden in policing, makes up about another third. So that's the fundamental balance that we look at and that we apply when we evaluate calls for service data. So in the report, we've recommended that the city engage in a process of defining what your proactive policing standard is. This is based on an International Association of Chiefs of Police best practice guideline, but it's flexible and ought to reflect what your community's values and perspective is. Well, what we will say is that making sure that there is space for officers to be able to focus on challenging areas and be responsive to incidents is a best practice. This is something that we would ultimately recommend. So we went through a process of analyzing calls for service data, and that's we went through an extensive analytical process over a few-year period. Now, go ahead, next slide, please. Now, there's one area that I do want to emphasize here. So obviously, everyone remembers the COVID years. So when we initiated this process in March of 2022, we were still, from a data collection perspective and from a data perspective, dealing with some of the fundamental changes that, frankly, temporary changes from a workload perspective that the COVID pandemic caused. So when we completed the calls for service analysis, we focused on 2019 data rather than 2020 or 2021 data because it was the most recent year that fully reflected what the calls for service model looked like, or what the calls for service experience would typically be. So when we completed that, we saw a number of trends. So looking at 2019 data, the number of reactive calls remained relatively consistent, 17, 18 to 19, with some increase in 19. Obviously, the COVID years, 2020 and 2021, calls for service decreased really nationwide, but fundamentally they have really started to return to previous levels. The proactive calls during that period also significantly reduced, and this is could be related to a few different areas. The national climate is one area that has driven some declines in officer-initiated activity from a preventative measure, from a community policing perspective. But fundamentally, what we saw was some reduction there. Now, what we did is analyze the calls for service data, but we also looked at your leave experience. Okay, so to hire one officer to fill one position, you need actually more than one officer, and that's because an individual officer is scheduled to work maybe 2,080 hours a year, but they have to fill nearly 2,900 hours of shift time per year, right? So what that means, if you look at the union required leave patterns, you look at training patterns, in Somerville you have to hire about 1.8 people to fill every one position on the patrol and in the sworn space, right? So we also looked at leave patterns and applied that to determine ultimately what your staffing needs to be per shift. And fundamentally, fundamentally, when we looked at the calls for service data, we looked at how it was balanced across the board. We ultimately recommended that you could reduce your minimum staffing, which is currently 7. It may not currently be 7, but it was 7 at the time of the analysis, which aligns with the ward system. All right. So fundamentally, you have a minimum staffing level that is based on has been historically based on a political boundary rather than a practical workload-driven boundary. Looking at the calls for service data, that could be reduced to 6 and still allow capacity for calls for some proactive and community policing. Okay. Next slide, please. So when we look at what this, go ahead and next slide, please. Thank you. So when we look at what this means, ultimately that equates to having a total of 43 patrol officers on a given, assigned to the patrol function. Now, this does not mean going from your authorized staffing, I think, is 88 now. I'm not sure how it's adjusted recently, but we're not talking about going from 88 to 43. 43 is patrol only. There's still investigative, there's still command staff, there's still other folks within the department that aren't included in this particular calculation. But again, this was really focused primarily on the patrol piece. So this ultimately translates, based on some other factors that have been baked in the analysis, 3 fewer than the baseline patrol staffing members at the time of this analysis. So a total of 3 positions that we would recommend be reallocated to other priority areas in the department. Now, with that, I'll turn it over to Cassandra so you can maybe listen to more than just me talk. So,
Thank you, Jonathan. So when we're talking about restructuring organizations, we've heard reimagining policing, and depending on what chief you ask, what city government you ask, you will get a different definition of what that looks like. And the range has been far and wide throughout the country since the beginning of those conversations. So around 2020 is when we began to really hear those words on a regular basis. The reality is there's no one size that fits all agencies because of the needs, the wants, and the wishes of any particular city or town within the United States. And so when you talk about reimagining also, there are opportunities to reallocate positions as well. And so this particular slide is speaking to how and what those options could look like if you were to reallocate positions. There are times where you reallocate sworn. There are other times where the sworn may become or may be considered a civilian position. And so we'll walk through some of those options as well. I want to talk specifically to 2 models at this time. And the first one is really looking at a sworn model. As we did the analysis, what we also saw was there were units within the police department that are no longer staffed. They're vacant. But when we look at the span of the work that we were doing, one key critical area of focus is also around community engagement. In this project, we considered that in a broad scope. We know that you all just completed the survey, another facet of community engagement, and the list goes on. And so when you hear those words, reimagining alternative models of policing, this is what some of that looks like. You all have, or the police department has, a community outreach and affairs unit. That position has historically had 7 positions, and it is currently vacant with no positions. Let me back up. At the time we conducted the study, at the beginning of it, those positions were vacant. So that is one of the opportunities, again, for community engagement and outreach, is to take those positions that Jonathan just spoke about and reallocate those to other, or repurpose those positions somewhere else in the department. In doing this, you would clearly afford an opportunity to re-engage, redesign, and reapproach what proactive policing looks like within your organization as well. This also allows you to have a dedicated capacity for the purpose of community engagement, problem solving, and it's our understanding that years ago you had a community policing unit. Traditional community policing has expanded in a lot of different ways, and part of that is because of the introduction of technology, thinking outside of the box, at times needing to remove one's department from traditional policing and look to see what is out there as communities change and evolve over time as well. And so one option could be to just realign those folk back to your outreach and affairs unit. Another possibility is to create community service officers. And this is sometimes where we hear the phrase alternative models of policing, where you have civilians in some capacities where once upon a time it would have been a sworn position. And by having non-sworn, unarmed personnel responding to certain types of calls, this would not necessarily mean that they respond to every call. Our recommendation is that, and typically when you look at calls for service, they're prioritized. And so this would be an opportunity for the city to look at the types of calls a non-sworn person or team of non-sworn people could respond to and handle, such as homelessness, public intoxication, prostitution, and the list goes on. A lot of times they are what we consider quality of life issues as well. It affords you another opportunity for community engagement. It allows for and community input. You know, this could afford you on the front end of developing something like this to gain community input and how it looks and why it looks a certain way as you collectively discuss what proactive policing models or a proactive policing model could look like here in your city. The benefit is both of these are priority-driven approaches. It just depends on what your priority is and who you wish to carry out that particular delivery of service within your city. It is important if you are implementing positions where there are non-sworn personnel, and perhaps even where there are sworn, once upon a time were sworn personnel and are no longer, you have to consider what resources will need to be poured into that space for those individuals to function and carry out whatever that service delivery model is as well. Is there equipment? Is there a I don't want to use the word uniform for a non-sworn person, but some type of a uniform, be it a golf shirt, whatever it looks like, business attire, whatever that is, making sure that those folk are fully functional to go forth and fully equipped to go forth and carry out the work that they need to do. This also, next slide, no, leave it on that. Take it back to the other slide. Oh, thanks. The other possibility as well is to ensure that if you look at something like a civilian initiative, that you look at it perhaps in stages, that you pilot it at first to see where's the give and take there. You may not have started out with enough folk, but realize there needs to be conversation to expand it. You have an opportunity then to observe the delivery service, who is receiving, who the clients are, who the consumers are of those services, and how it can be expanded or not. It may prove to be an initiative that you don't want in your city, but I have seen in many other cities where they started out taking baby steps, and those initiatives have expanded broadly to render a greater service because there was a greater demand. And what this affords the department to do is to offer a service where there is not the threat of the uniform. And so there's another opportunity for de-escalation, trust building, relationship building, input, opportunities to share, and just reach across the table to those who may not otherwise reach out to law enforcement for a need if they had one. Next slide, please. So we also took a look, as Jonathan has briefly talked about, investigations. And when we looked at it, we also looked at the work that they're doing and the type of work that they do collectively. And most people, there are enough cop shows out there that you know investigators investigate cases, make arrests, follow up in court, and the list goes on. But there's a whole lot more that goes into that. Next slide, please. So what we took a look at also is the percentage of crimes that are assigned for investigation, and we did this by category. For the most part, cases have been historically divided into Part 1 and Part 2 crimes, violent crimes against persons as well as property crimes. And the FBI has reclassified those cases into what's now the National Incident-Based Reporting System, which is NIBRS as opposed to UCR. Nonetheless, we show this particular graph because it gives you a point of reference. And as you look at 2017 to 22, there's sort of a flipped switch there in that you can see that there is an increase in the number of cases that are being assigned as it relates to violent crime. And you've seen where property crime cases have been there's a decrease in the amount of cases assigned. And then you see other, and there's a rise in other as well. Other sort of falls into that space I mentioned earlier as it related to the non-sworn staff responding to those types of calls. So other is the drug call, the prostitution, the trespass, and the alcohol, et cetera. Those quality of life issues that very often have a relationship and at times a relationship of causality to both violent and property crime. And so, as you can see, over time, that number has increased as well. So, of course, next slide. So, of course, if cases are being assigned, then the question is, what does the clearance rate look like for those cases as well? So we looked at that also to see overall effort, the processing, what happens to those cases once they are assigned to a detective. And first of all, just wanted to give just a little overview of what a clearance rate is. And basically that is the closure of a case. And that comes about for a number of reasons. One is a simple arrest. The case itself may be closed, although it still has to go to court and so forth. Sometimes, as noted here, it could very well be that someone has died. It could be that the suspect died. So there's nobody to prosecute. However, there are other reasons. The district attorney may decide not to prosecute a case. They may have identified the suspect, may have identified a witness, but for some reason, that case never makes it to court. That case can actually be closed out, and there are different categories for closure. So the clearance rate here in Somerville, we did compare also to other similarly sized cities in New England. And from a property crime standpoint, it was slightly lower than similar sized cities in New England. Violent crime, on the other hand, was slightly higher than the clearance rate for similarly sized cities in New England. And when I say slightly in this case, we really are talking about 1 to 2 percentage points. It's not very drastic, but we did compare. And one of the recommendations that we have is to, and we'll talk more about it, but basically we would recommend to add another detective, and that detective would be to investigate those property crimes. I know that there have been some things that are already underway within your department. The importance of this is making sure that there's an adequate means of investigating such cases. And the reason being is we often hear words like perception versus reality. And both of those are sometimes referenced in such a way that Jonathan may have been the victim of a case, but I have already drawn a perception about how it was either handled, just what he's going through. And so I have a perception about police services, the justice system, whatever the police response, whatever that looks like. And then if you don't have a way of addressing those cases, investigating those cases, and understanding that some cases don't have any leads, so there's very little that you can do with that case to begin with. But if you don't have the resources to conduct those investigations, there are missed opportunities. There are missed opportunities, one, to connect with that person who somehow, some way has been victimized. Two, there is a lost opportunity to determine and evaluate trends and patterns that are ongoing, because criminals don't necessarily stop because they hit one house. But also, there is a lost opportunity to identify not just the trend and the pattern, but who those frequent offenders are, and addressing that and bringing those individuals to justice. So that recommendation, next slide please. So that recommendation, as mentioned, is to add at least one property crimes detective. And there again, we do recognize in the previous slide that property numbers referred to the investigator actually decreased. But there again, as I've mentioned, there are lost opportunities. Again, the need to feel safe, the need to have that reality or that perception addressed in some way, the need to build that trust and that relationship back with the community. These are opportunities. We also looked at the Family Services Unit as well, and saw that in that case, in those instances between 2016 and 2022, they actually had a case clearance of about 32%, which is actually in comparison higher than on average cities across the country. And those cases specifically that we're talking about are sex assaults and sex crimes. And what we do emphasize here, though, is it's important with those kinds of cases as well to oversee an analysis piece of it to ensure that all stages of those cases are properly handled. You all may have seen or heard throughout the country there has been a movement about processing rape cases and making sure that they can be investigated or followed up and analysis and forensics conducted. And part of that has to do with the technology that's now afforded for DNA and forensic analysis that wasn't necessarily available 20 years ago. And being able to just ensure, because of the level of victimization, that that case oversight is managed and that the department can effectively meet the needs of those who are in need at that time. Next slide, please. We also looked at civilianization beyond the community service positions that we talked about earlier. And one of the areas that we looked at, next slide please, is the police desk, as well as the City Hall liaison position. So looking at the police desk, there are 9 officers who basically answer the telephone. They do receive and take information as it's coming through the department. There's also a civilian staff member that works at the desk with those individuals. And this may be an opportunity for allocating those positions, some of those positions, leaving 4 in place and taking 4 and placing them somewhere else in the department. The reason behind this is because a lot of the work that they do is primarily administrative, not necessarily leaving your police desk bare, but having a sworn person there, along with a civilian person. So the civilian person could do more of the administrative function, while that desk officer also has to, we do know that that desk officer keeps watch over as well. There's the individuals who are in lockup awaiting transfer to the county jail are there, but that's on a temporary basis, but making sure that there is a sworn person available. And on the midnight shift, of course, there's a watch commander as well. So you would have an additional sworn person should you need, but making sure that we can be or you all can be as efficient as possible when you are looking at the operations of the desk. And what those individuals are doing at the desk really came down to a lot of administrative work, where there may be an opportunity to afford those police and sworn individuals to be more efficient and more effective in a different capacity within the organization. There again, as mentioned, you also have that outreach and affairs unit as well. I wanted to briefly talk about the City Hall liaison. When we took a look at this position, the title is, I think, it doesn't really capture what the person does. Because while we know that this person may fill the seat of a driver on occasion, may handle some dignitary protection details at other times, what we also know is that this person is handling a lot of police functions and wearing multiple hats in this space, coordinating law enforcement, coordinating and working with other law enforcement agencies, should city officials have to go into those jurisdictions and so forth, handling inspections, following up on probably calls that are diverted as opposed to going directly into the mayor's office, and just addressing sort of a laundry list of things. So the options there are, you have the option always of reallocating. But this may be where, should you keep and retain that position because of the unique functionality, in addition to being driver and those having those roles, this may be an opportunity to ensure and allow that person to maintain those police functions in that seat as well. And just knowing that there is a lot more than driver and providing the dignitary function. And there again, it gives the city the opportunity to look at the highest and the best use of another position. And another option could be civilianizing that, contracting with a company or someone who could carry out some of those details, but recognizing not all of those details may be afforded to a person who does not have the law enforcement capacity in that space. Next slide, please. Still looking at opportunities for civilianization, we also looked at the 911 center as well, and we looked at the crossing guard supervisor position. The 911 manager position that oversees the dispatching unit at the time of this study is a lieutenant, an admin lieutenant, who does not specialize in 911 at all. That person oversees this unit along with others within the department. However, we see both models in law enforcement across the country. Sometimes you see where supervisors who are sworn oversee the unit, and sometimes you even see where sworn people are in dispatching roles. But you also see where that whole section, that whole team is non-sworn. And by making that a non-sworn position, what you then do is have an opportunity, again, to reallocate a person within the organization and place a civilian person in that supervisory seat, which then allows also future opportunities for advancement, greater professional development, as well as support and retention within that particular space also. Taking a look further at the crossing guard supervisor position, this role is held by an officer. And all of the crossing guards are civilian. The role and the work that person does is, one, they oversee the school crossing guards. They look at pedestrian safety as a whole, and they also conduct, among some other roles and responsibilities, they conduct hit-and-run investigations also. Now, recognizing that there's a possibility in a hit-and-run that someone may be charged, this would be where the city, the department has to take a look at what roles and capacity could be carried out by a civilian in this position, and what legislation affords in this type of circumstance as well. There are times where probable cause is transferred to a sworn person. So one person does the investigation, somebody else makes the charge, but they're again giving you the opportunity to reallocate a sworn officer who is overseeing civilian employees at the present time. Should this happen, we also recommend looking for a different title that is less officer-centric and more along the lines of a non-sworn title, something like a safety manager or something along those lines. Next slide, please. So I think I started with the conversation about community engagement, and I know John touched on it as well. And we've seen where this has sort of been a great premise in the conversations we've had, the discussions we've had with others, the need, the want for this from a community perspective, from you all sharing information as well, and from the officers sharing it as well. And so we looked at what that could look like, and there were two things that, there are other areas, but there were two things that sort of resonated throughout the work that we did. Next slide, please. And so there were two key engagement topics that continued to rise. At the time we began this, it was our understanding that there was some considerable conversation about the implementation of body-worn cameras at that time. And then over and over again, we heard the resonating conversation about community proactive policing, community engagement as a whole. And then looking to see what that could look like down the road. You know, I think when we use words like the world is your oyster, it really can be when you talk about community policing, when you talk about proactive policing, and when there is a vested interest, I think, with so many parties, and particularly the elected officials, you have the opportunity to design that the way that you want to and how you believe, and seeking input from the community on what that should and how it could look like, beginning by defining what proactive policing looks like, understanding, and there have been a lot of words used over time, community-based policing, community policing, and the list goes on. But what you're really looking for is fairness, you're looking for equity in treatment, you're looking at respect, you're looking at a relationship, you're looking at problem-oriented policing, problem-solving, you're looking for mutual understanding and mutual acceptance. And so this is that opportunity to collectively decide, and some of that may already be in the surveys that you've already conducted, as to what does your community want community policing, proactive policing to look like in this city? Not what it looks like in the city next door, but what does it look like here? And what does the community not want it to look like? And so this is a tremendous opportunity. When you talk about community engagement, you start with this, an opportunity to evaluate what policy and procedure, and ultimately, when you talk about whatever word you choose, what is the philosophy and the culture within the organization? What does that look like as it relates to policing? And when you talk about community policing, it is a philosophy. And having that balance between the two, community, law enforcement, and their responsibility is key. But it is a tremendous opportunity to promote further transparency, accountability, expectations on both sides, and building that trust. It's an opportunity to create greater dialogue as well. When we look at the body-worn camera piece, as I mentioned, this was a topic under discussion when we first started. There again, another opportunity for community engagement. We still, as long as the topic of body-worn cameras have been on the table now, we know that there are departments across the country that still have not implemented a camera system for a lot of different reasons. But this is an opportunity, if this city is seeking implementation, an opportunity for engaging with community. There's a need to understand from a legislative standpoint what the concerns are around privacy, around disclosure, around being able to view video and releasing that video to the public. What are the laws around it? And just as intentional, and this is that opportunity again, just as intentional as a department would be in determining which of the many different products it has out there, the department and the city could be just as intentional about the community engagement piece and giving communities the opportunity to voice, but to offer opinions and to be able to share from the ground up as policy is developed and ultimately implemented. Again, an opportunity for both transparency and accountability in this arena. And we also looked at performance and accountability. And when we did this, we looked at a number of areas. We looked at command diversity. We looked at the bid system. We looked at dispatch performance monitoring, and we looked at civilian review. And each one brought its own issues and areas of concern. As we looked at command diversity, we saw a couple of things. One is command typically brings experience, but it doesn't necessarily bring an opportunity for DEI. Ensuring that there is diversity in the command structure, allows for the understanding of equity as well as inclusion. When that is not seen, there is, and we did hear this, that there's a perception or a reality from those from within the organization who believe that there is not an opportunity for them to advance within the department. When there are narrow demographics, what it also does is it limits a cultural competence in those areas regarding women, ethnic minorities, and racial issues. But flipping that same topic, when there is a narrow demographic from an external standpoint, you get a similar perspective, and that is the community may not believe that there is a cultural competence in understanding what their needs are when they represent those same demographics that I just referenced, minorities, people of color, women, LGBT, and the list goes on. And so building that capacity from a command standpoint speaks all the way down to the lowest ranking individual within the organization. We also, and so that also includes building those relationships within the community so that there's a reciprocal understanding of commitment for diversity and inclusion and equity, and thus allowing for segues and opportunities to recruit based on that relationship that exists in the community and that cultural competence within the organization. It may open doors for recruitment and retention within the department as well. Then we looked at the bid system. Typically, positions are gained, promotions are gained and acquired because of seniority. And so there's a recommendation to reevaluate that process. We know that that becomes a contract discussion on some level. However, we also saw that in 2022, the chief's pick, the chief actually looked at a number of positions and looked at the skill set to ensure that they were best fits for the needs within the organization. And this may be what needs to be more aligned with promotions going forward to ensure that there is opportunity for those who are not necessarily senior within the organization, but realize that they could work in such a way that their skill set rises to a level where they could be considered for future assignments and promotions and so forth. The detective's process is already in step with something like that. And then we looked at dispatch. And what we saw there was no real formal metrics to really measure dispatchers in terms of efficiencies. And so putting quality control systems in place, that is, and you would have to do something like this even with the body-worn camera piece. Making sure that somebody is conducting audits and reviewing and listening to those 911 calls to ensure that the customer service is rendered properly, that the dispatchers are properly trained, and so forth. And understanding also from an efficiency metric, from the time the call is made or from the time the phone rings, how quickly is it picked up? How quickly is it dispatched? And so forth. Are they meeting compliance standards? And there are best practices in the Association of Public Safety Dispatchers. In that association, there are protocols and whatnot in place. So this may give the department another opportunity to just really work towards efficiencies there. And then looking at pay. So your police dispatchers pretty much do the same comparable type work as your fire dispatchers do, but there's about a $10,000 difference in the position's pay. And so looking at equity within similar and like positions is a recommendation as well. And we've already talked about civilianizing that supervisor in that space. And maybe looking at opportunities for advancing within that space also. The fire department has different levels of dispatcher within their office. And then we looked at the civilian review. And recognizing that the task force is already underway and working in some capacity there, but just recommending that however this is determined to be implemented, ensuring that there again diversity is represented, that subject matter experts are identified so that you can truly meet the mission, the vision, and the goals that you all set as it relates to having that civilian review capacity and being intentional and deliberate in what that looks like going forward. So that's pretty much it. I did just want to, before I turn it back over to John, just to say that a lot of times even when you look at departments and you think that those numbers are small, this is not the largest department, but when you start looking at every single aspect of that department, you realize the overall functionality and the purpose and the service that is delivered throughout the department and to the greater community. And we also know that communities across this country have lived experiences of encounters with police that range from the best services one could ever imagine to the very worst services anyone can imagine. And so when you talk about the roles and responsibilities and expectations of a police department, I do just want to say that you all as the city officials as well, you're chartered to also be responsible and accountable to ensure that public safety happens, and your survey was, public safety for all, and really taking that inclusive step to ensure that wherever these surveys and reports go, that you have, and we hope that you have been provided with as much information as you can, knowing that there's an arduous task ahead of you. But we also know that with any study, regardless of when you start it and regardless of when you stop it, it is a snapshot in time of what was taking place at that time. And it is not uncommon either for where you start in time with city priorities to be in one place and city priorities to have shifted over that time as well. So hopefully we have helped to shed a little bit of light on next steps for you all and where you go with this. And I will turn it over to John.
I think we'll stop talking at you for a few minutes and give you all the opportunity to ask questions. I know it was about an hour presentation. We apologize there, but it's certainly a lot of detail in here, and wanted to make sure we communicated as much context as possible, both to you as well as to members of the public who may be watching or listening from afar. So at this point, I'll open it up for any questions you may have or any other procedural requirements you have.
Thank you. Councilor Wilson, you're up first.
Thanks, Chair. Through you, I imagine my colleagues have many questions, as I do, so I'll refrain from asking all of mine up front here and just start by asking about two things I didn't see in this report that are constantly on my radar. The first is details. We might anticipate eventual decline in demand here as construction and infrastructure work eventually lessen in the city, but it's just such a major issue, and it's considering the really high cost to the city in our budget. I want to name that. You've all heard Councilor Ewan-Campen and I both talk at length about this on numerous occasions. I'll just say I met with the Patrol Officers Association leadership and rank and file, and I've advocated for changing language in the CBA during the current negotiation, basically to replace sworn police officer with sworn officer, thinking being it would open up details to parking control officers and firefighters, and then set up a hierarchy for grabbing available detail shifts, basically give first dibs to Somerville Police Department, then PCOs and firefighters, then outside police officers. And I guess I saw that there's the detail supervisor and detail administrator mentioned in there. Is the detail administrator designed to be a civilian position?
I'll actually have to go back and take a look at that. I can't quite recall, but as I recall, and we may need the chief to answer the question, but I believe it was a sworn position that handles a lot of other duties as well, right? So that's what I recall, but I may be incorrect there. Now, in terms of the kind of the question around off-duty assignments, essentially, I think whatever you all can do, and certainly the collective bargaining agreement, that's a process in and of itself. I think all of you are well aware of that. Whatever you can do to decrease the things that draw away from core services is likely a good thing. Now, it's a conversation. It impacts pay. It impacts a lot, and there are a lot of levers there. In terms of whether we specifically called it out as a recommendation, it doesn't preclude you from pursuing that course of action for sure.
And then through the chair, the second thing that comes up a lot that wasn't mentioned specifically or really linked was traffic enforcement. I might hear about this more than anything else related to the police at this point. I know our police department feels like they're sort of caught in a tug of war between calls for more enforcement and a desire to see reduced number of traffic stops. I guess we're just waiting for automated traffic enforcement, provided it can be done in a fair and equitable way. I'd be curious, was traffic enforcement something that came up that was considered to be in this report and just didn't make it?
Sure. So I think certainly if you look at the survey results, and I think a lot of what we heard is that there was a priority of traffic enforcement. So when you think about having capacity of your officers, you can have a traffic safety unit, you can have folks, but you're never going to have enough folks in a traffic safety unit to have a fundamental impact on traffic patterns. The way you solve or provide any significant attention is to create capacity for your patrol officers to provide support. So when you build in space for officer-initiated activity, a big part of that is creating the capacity for the biggest chunk of your sworn contingent, your patrol officers, to do the things that are of public safety priority in your community. Could be traffic safety, traffic enforcement. So that's where that capacity comes from.
Chair, I'll just say it's good to finally have this report. We've gone through 2 budget seasons now anticipating this, so it's just very good to have this in front of us. I'll have more questions later, but I want to open up to colleagues.
Councilor Kelly.
Thanks so much, Chair. Through you to the 2 presenters, thank you so much for being with us tonight and providing all of this information. I have lots of questions. Clerk, is it possible to actually pull up the report instead of the PowerPoint? Because I'm going to go through questions based on the page numbers in the report. Yep. Cool. That's the PowerPoint. Yes, please. Thank you. So I have a couple of high-level definition questions because I think understanding the language that we're all using is really critical to make sure we're all on the same page. So, and you spoke so eloquently about the necessity to define what proactive policing is in every community. I mean, in page 33 of the report, you talk extensively about how there needs to be a process around defining what proactive policing is versus what proactive policing is not. And, in the course of the interviews that we had as counselors with the consultants, yourselves, we talked primarily about community policing. So could you just talk a little bit about how you all and your consultant firm defines proactive policing when you're working with clients like ourselves, the city? How are you defining proactive policing? Is it the same as community policing? Because that's the language that's been used often in Somerville, so that it would just be helpful to start there.
Yeah. So Cassandra may have some kind of context to add here as well, but so it is one of those things that maybe has a different definition depending on where you go, right? And ultimately, we're trying to create capacity for two things. The ability for officers to initiate activity or to focus in areas, to have essentially free time to focus in areas that have historical crime patterns or that are responses to specific incidents. So there's that part that's a responsive element. The other piece is community policing and building relationships, and the two are really very much integrated, and if you think about it as a Venn diagram, there's quite a bit of overlap, right? It's building relationships, it's building trust, it's having the time and having the capacity to be able to do that. Now, how you use that time, so I mentioned the 33% of an officer's time being available for that proactive or community policing. How a community chooses to use that time or not use that time is a valid policy discussion, right? The activities you don't want, there are communities who choose not to engage in drug enforcement, right? There are communities who make all sorts of policy decisions about what they are or are not going to do. But that decision needs to be an active conversation that's informed by the subject matter expertise and the consequences of those particular policy decisions, that's informed by the subject matter expertise among your police staff and your command staff.
Thank you for that. Just going forward, this is, I think, really helpful for the public to understand, but also the public to buy into this process. The phrase best practices got used a lot. I work in a field where I use the phrase best practice a lot, and I know what that means. And I know the sources that I'm citing when I'm defining best practice. So could you just talk a little bit about who is determining some of these best practices? Who were you citing when you were discussing and pulling in best practice sources into the report? Just, again, getting some kind of baseline definition so we all know what we're talking about here.
Sure, it can come from lots of different places. So there's typically I'd say three sources of best practices. One is things that we have seen work well in other communities that are clients or other communities that we know. So communities that maybe have faced some of the similar challenges you have, implemented programs that have been effective. So it's basically learned experience from other communities who have tackled similar problems that you have. So that's kind of the first piece. The second piece is institutional knowledge or institutional entities. So, Cassandra mentioned the Association for Public Safety Communicators, it's called APCO, communication officers. They've defined a number of rigorous best practices around how to implement effective quality control programs for dispatch, because dispatch is extremely critical, and there's a huge challenge recruiting for dispatchers right now, right? So it's institutions that are typically national organizations that issue these best practices. You can kind of cite documents, that kind of thing, right? And the other sort of area where there are best practices is some of our own repository and things that we have developed as a firm. So things that we have offered as recommendations. So it's really those three sources that will typically inform what a best practice is from our view.
Thank you for that. And maybe this is a homework assignment, and I don't want to have you edit this report. Obviously, you spent an immense amount of time on it, but I do think for the purpose of transparency and public buy-in to this process, just knowing exactly who we're citing, who we're referencing when we talk about best practices, allows our residents, allows the public, allows us as elected officials to engage in the process and also look at those sources. So if there's any way you could provide, a short list of some of the best folks that you tap into, the best resources, as a supplemental item after this meeting, that would be fabulous.
Coincidentally, we have an internal document that we use that is essentially a survey of what lots of different communities are doing. I'd be happy to share that. It's just links and things like that that you can look at.
That would be great. I really appreciated the footnotes in the report, so the more footnotes, the better. And then similarly on this kind of definition setting conversation we're having, the phrase reallocation got used a lot. I have a definition of what I think reallocation looks like. I don't know if that's necessarily the same as what you all are defining as reallocation. So when you talk about reallocating positions or reallocating labor, right, work that needs to happen, when you say that, are you referring to a reallocation within the Somerville Police Department or a reallocation within the city of Somerville?
Within the police department.
Okay. Okay. So this is reallocating work from one place in SPD to another place in SPD.
It's shifting resources to realign where you're putting people, what type of training or experience or role those people serve based on how workload drivers are indicating the need.
Got it. Okay, thank you. Okay, so moving on to some of the more specific items that were in the report, I deeply appreciated the number crunching that went into so much of this. It's very obvious just from reading the 52 pages that there was a lot of math that went into making this report. So on page 22 of the report, you're talking about basically this calculation that you've made around the number of hours an officer works versus how many hours that actually comes out to when you calculate in the leave time, the sick time, and training, et cetera, et cetera. So just one of the things that was listed is there's 117 hours of vacation time a year, and then there's 116 hours of other leave. Is that sick time? Is that personal time? What falls into the other leave category?
Yeah, so sick, military leave, those kinds of things. So it's essentially parental leave would roll into that, FMLA would roll into that, those sorts of things. So it's essentially everything that's outlined in the contract as being an accessible form of leave.
Got it. So the 116 hours of other leave, that's the ceiling of what people could be taking. It's not an average of what people are actually taking.
I'm actually drawing a blank as to whether or not we use the averages or whether we use what was in the contract, what was contractually allotted. I believe we use the actuals.
Okay. I mean, if that's a question that we follow up and take offline, that's fantastic. Just because I think I get allocated.
I have to go back and read the report and
totally fair.
Again, just to suss that out.
I ask that only because I get given I think 15 sick days a year from my collective bargaining agreement. I don't use them, right?
It's average. It's the average of actual consumed. Yes.
Got it. So the average SPD officer is using almost the same amount of vacation time and other leave in a single calendar year. Wow. Okay.
Actually.
Good to know. And just kind of moving through, I was struck by some of the language around vacancy rates and turnover. And I think in the presentation it was mentioned that there were 7 vacant positions, but I went back and I looked at the FY24 budget, which includes a personnel table that lists every person in every department at the time of which the report has been published, which is the end of June 2023 is the marker. And just by that table alone, there were only 2 sworn officer vacancies in the department. There were 5 civilian officer vacancies, but there were only 2 patrol officer vacancies. Now, the report talks about how vacancies and turnovers are really high in SPD, but when I look at 2 vacancies in the sworn officer side of SPD, that feels quite average, in my opinion, and I'm editorializing a little bit here. But when was the vacancy data collected? That's helpful to know. Sure, yeah. Because if 2 is considered really high, then Jesus, I don't want you to look at the other departments in the city.
No, it's not, no. So we started this process in March 2022. So that was really the initiation of the assessment process. We went through, as I mentioned, the staff interview process, extensive data analytics, a lot of work kind of in that space, really over a 1-year period, to come up with essentially what the baseline data tells us. Then before we finalized any recommendations, it was essentially paused paused to allow the corresponding public engagement process to come to a place where we could answer the question, did anything come out of the city's process that would lead us to adjusting recommendations in any way? So what you'll see is that the analytical work, the data that goes into the analysis that's in the report is maybe a little further back than what your current budget is. So that would explain it.
Got it. That's super helpful, because if we were talking of March 2022,
Sure.
there were quite a few vacancies that were hired in March of 2022 versus March of 2023. That vacancy number is quite decreased.
Understood.
And obviously then we get closer to June of 2023 and there are only 2 sworn officer vacancies versus the 5 civilian and SPD. So it's helpful to know that the staffing data was collected between, I'm guessing, March 2022 to March 2023.
About a 1-year period.
Okay,
yeah.
thank you. That's helpful. So I just now want to dig into a little bit of one of the recommendations portion of page 22 and 23. We're sticking on that page because it was really meaty. There was a lot of information on it. So again, really grateful for all of the numbers y'all crunched in doing this report. It's very obvious that you've got a mathematician or a statistician on your team who worked on this project.
Her name's Claire. She's not here today.
Thank you, Claire, for all your work. So in the, recommendations around shifting staff levels, keeping this kind of one-third approach to proactive, reactive, and kind of administrative work, but also looking at the data around shift needs and shift requirements based on calls for service. The math comes out to, and you've said this, 6 folks on staff for the bare minimum during the daytime, 6 in the evening, and then 3 at night. So just for my colleagues, this is page 22. I think this is really the meat of so much of what we're going to be talking about. So the recommendation is for there to be 33 patrol officers in totality. I think we have 52 at the moment. Does that number seem correct?
I'm not sure what the current allocation is.
That's fine. I can
And
go
it's
back.
ultimately 43 to account for some other issues. So 43 is the base number.
Right. So, but what I'm trying to understand is how we get from 33 to 43. The recommendations given say we should add 3 positions just to have a comfortable 6, 6, and 6. 6 on at daytime, 6 on at evenings, and 6 on at night. But then the project team recommends allocating 10 additional patrol positions to minimize operational disruptions due to vacancies and turnovers. I can't for the life of me understand where this 10 number comes from, because if we're just looking at the 33 that are recommended as absolute baseline, adding an additional 10 patrol officers, that is a 30% increase to what the 33 baseline recommended would be. That's a huge jump, right? If every department that had high vacancies and high turnovers added 30% of their staff to their staffing, that would be immense. So I'm really trying to understand this 10 additional positions.
Sure. So I wouldn't really frame them as 10 additional. So there's 2 things. So there's a concept it's called overhiring, which you intentionally do, especially in spaces that you have to staff 24/7, to allow for transitions in terms of retirements, in terms of vacancies, and to ensure that you can still maintain that level, right? Because when you get into periods where you have significant drops in personnel due to vacancies, due to retirements, whatever that looks like, dropping below 6 would be fundamentally problematic. So when you think about 6 as a minimum, right, it's not necessarily what you want to be every day.
Sure.
Right? So that's the first piece. The other piece is based on some of the tenets of the contract and the agreement, right? One of the challenges that the department is facing now, again, I don't know what the current vacancy numbers are, but was facing then as well, was forced holdovers for overtime. And when you look at leave patterns, when you average something over a 1-year period, it's easier to kind of aggregate and balance things out. But when you look at how officers would actually use the contractually obligated leave that they have, it becomes compressed in very specific periods of time. So you have to be able to balance some of those fluctuations to create that space there.
Totally reasonable. I guess I'm trying to understand why 10? Why not 5, right? That would be a 15% increase to the bare minimum staffing that's required. It's an easier pill to swallow when you look at other vacancies and turnover rates in other departments and you compare just the staffing shortages we're experiencing across the city. And so what's the difference between 10 additional positions or 5? Does it make a market improvement? Is it just 10 was a round number?
Yeah, so if you think about 3 shifts, okay, you essentially have 3 shifts. Each of those shifts is going to have 3 teams, essentially, that needs to serve on that shift. So if you break it out by shift, it's really not adding that many people per shift. So when you create that leave factor, it's 1 or 2 people on a given shift period over a year, maybe 3, where you get there. You see what I mean? So being able to balance multiple patrol teams, because you have interlocking and overlapping schedules that get you there, especially with a 4-day on, 2-day off schedule. That's really ultimately what the driver is, because you have to staff for those multiple patrol teams.
Sure, and maybe this is a policy conversation that we should be having as a council, but I definitely, I'm struggling with this number because this is not the practice that we use in any other department in the city. I work with teachers. If we staffed 30% because we knew that teachers were going to be leaving the district and out sick because they're dealing with kiddos, we would have a million more teachers in public education across the country. So I'm struggling with this 10 number. It feels as slightly counterintuitive to the math that's previously put into the report, but that's not here nor there. We'll have that conversation as a council when we get to that point.
Right.
On page 23 of the report, just moving through the kind of patrol officer recommendations, one of the items that's noted here as part of the reason why we have to have the number of patrol officers that we have is large city events. Summer Street, Porch Fest are all referenced here. Was there particular additional calls for service around those big city events? What was driving the reference specifically around needing more, patrol officers for those?
We don't really outline that you need patrol officers for those. This is really the conversation around those are, if you went to if you chose as a community that we were not going to do proactive policing. If you said our service level is we're going to move away from that and our only role is going to be responding to calls for service. So if you go down to that level of staffing, in addition to not being able to respond to those incidents, you lose some of the extra capacity that comes to be able to staff some of these events. It's just one of the examples that you can use.
But at the end of the day, it's a policy choice if we decide to have officers at large events or not.
It's a policy choice with some significant challenges associated with it. It's certainly not one that we would recommend as a firm.
Okay. I'm just moving along my questions. Just speaking on the issue of vacancy data, page 28 of the report, I'm just scrolling down. A big part of what was discussed in this kind of reallocation of positions within SPD to other divisions, I found the discussion very interesting in your presentation, but also in the report. Could you just talk a little bit more? Could you go into depth, just slightly more about the divisions or the departments and the staffing adequacies around them? I'm on page 29 in particular. I'm trying to find my reference. You discussed the property crimes detective and the fact that we need to reallocate staffing work to make sure that there's a property crimes detective, and how there were other departments and divisions that were adequately staffed. I think you said the family service unit was adequately staffed.
Yeah.
Could you just talk about which departments and divisions felt adequately staffed, and was the property crime detective, was that the only unit that's felt understaffed?
Is it the only unit that, well, I would say if we didn't specifically call out, what I don't really intend to do is go through each unit and sort of speak to recollection. If we didn't specifically call it out as a staffing need in the report, then our assumption is that they're appropriately staffed at the time. Okay. The property crimes investigator, this is the piece. So one of the things that Cassandra highlighted, the frequency of assigning property crimes to investigation has declined, and the reason that it has declined is because of the capacity and and essentially hours available to do that work. Now, if you have a detective who is handling violent crimes, the number of cases they can handle is much smaller, right? It's a much more in-depth investigation. Typically, it requires multiple personnel. It's kind of an all-hands-on-deck sort of event for a person crime, especially one that reflects significant violence, right? Property crimes are much more frequent. They are the thing that impacts most folks' quality of life most consistently. You can see that in the survey results, right? And for many people, they're the worst part of their year if you have a property crime, right? And there's really not capacity looking at investigative labor hours available to be able to really adequately assign that. So that's the basis of that recommendation, okay? Now, what we're trying to do is create capacity to reallocate some of the resources you can pull from other places, put them in the property crime space, connect with your community expectations and service level goals there,
Right.
And be able to dedicate more resources toward a very common type of crime that impacts a lot of people.
Got it. That's super helpful. I just really appreciate the way the report was framing departments and divisions and their staffing capacity, because I think we've had a number of conversations on this council about whether certain departments or divisions are staffed adequately. And so, again, having all this data is very helpful. Councilor Wilson hit on this point a little bit earlier, but I'm just wondering if you can talk slightly more in detail around traffic details. This is an issue that constituents talk to us about all the time, both in favor of more traffic details, in favor of different styles of traffic details. Community groups have written entire little booklets on traffic detailing in the city. And so the fact that it was absent from the report was kind of shocking, I'm not gonna lie. Could you just talk about why traffic details were excluded from any of the report, or did you collect any information on traffic details and just decided it wasn't super relevant? Could you just speak to that a bit more?
Yeah, so, and maybe it's not as explicit as it should be, but it's obviously a community priority. If you look at the survey results, again, I'll keep kind of pointing back to those. It's a big priority. And again, connecting data to experience, we drove here this evening and I can tell it's a priority, right? So now, again, the space here, and this is, again, why I would not recommend going to a place where you're only responding to calls for service, right? But creating capacity for patrol officers to enforce traffic and potentially bending their focus, especially during some of these peak workload periods, to provide that targeted enforcement is a completely viable focus for officer-initiated activity. Now, if the expectation in the community is we want more traffic enforcement, but we don't want more traffic tickets, you all will need to have a really intentional conversation about how those two things don't go together. So, with the community. Now, there's a lot of other traffic calming measures. There's traffic engineering things. It's a solution that involves many more departments, and I think, but from our view, so ultimately what we really look at is is staffing levels. Are we recommending you add to the traffic unit? Not necessarily.
Sure.
But we're recommending you have the capacity to dedicate your folks toward traffic enforcement.
Sure, and I guess when I'm talking about traffic details, I'm talking about a flagger at a construction site and so I guess part of what I was a little bit shocked to not see in the report is, there's like 18,000 annual hours of traffic details that SPD officers put in either as forced overtime or just off time that they're putting into a traffic detail. In your professional opinion, do you think that if we freed up traffic details from the responsibility of SPD, that officers would have more capacity for proactive policing if that was the rest of their time, if they weren't spending time being a flagger on a street at a construction site?
I don't know that I could answer that question honestly without really looking at the kind of data you're referring to, without having, we said 18,000 hours?
That's, again, these are numbers calculated by the public, so that's part of the reason why I was hoping there would be some anecdotal evidence within the report to corroborate what the public has reported on. Future studies. Okay. And then My last question, and I promise I'll turn it over to my colleagues, and I appreciate all your detailed responses and following along with the PowerPoint and the actual report. So on several pages, your recommendations include, the phrase that policy decisions should be made by the elected officials, right? By the mayor's office, by the city council, and yet there were several times in the report where policy choices were being passed over to SPD to make. I'm thinking particularly about the CSO positions, the non-sworn officer community engagement folks. I think it was on page 26, where the line explicitly says that SPD should decide if a civilian non-sworn community service officer position exists or if a department exists. Now, personally, I think that's a policy choice that the elected official should be making. So could you just talk a little bit about when it feels that SPD should be making policy choices on staffing capacity versus when electeds and public officials should be making decisions on staffing choices? Because that, in particular, was a bit startling to read.
Sure. So, one of kind of the first thing that I'll say broadly is that any policy decision this council makes in conjunction with the administration's office should be fundamentally informed by the expert opinion of the police officers who are tasked and the command staff who is tasked with enforcing the law. So that conversation, any reference to developing policy in this report, it ought to be implied that conversation needs to be informed by those folks. Now, should SPD alone decide whether you use a CSO or not? I think there are broader budget discussions. I think in terms of that, it's a broader discussion. I think that's implied. There are also, however, laws and officer safety considerations, union considerations. There is a framework that has to be considered in conjunction, where that policy decision or a policy discussion won't fundamentally change what the department's responsibility is for enforcing that crime. So you really have to look at that almost on a case-by-case basis and have that broader conversation in a way that takes into account the really critical input and expertise, and it is expertise of the department, but also pulls your perspective as the representatives of your community, that pulls the mayor's office as the chosen administrator for this community's programs, and pulls those really three fundamental perspectives together to offer a path forward.
Thanks for that. And this is actually my last question. So in preparing for tonight, I went back and I reviewed the 2001 management study. I reviewed the 2005 Harshberger report. There have been so many instances in the history of policing in Somerville where we've had this conversation where literally exact recommendations that you were making tonight in this report were made 20 years ago. I'm no longer going to be on the council in about a month from now, so I hope that you all come back when you have your implementation document created and present to the new council. Hopefully the public will have had time to digest this report. But really, in this implementation document that we don't have at the moment, so we're doing a little bit of wish casting here, how is the public going to trust that these pieces are actually going to be implemented? How are you going to outline the recommendations that you've put together in a way that both the city and the council can really enforce and put into action, but also that our residents, our constituents can hold us accountable to doing in a really manageable way?
Yeah, so our task and our commitment is to provide recommendations that we feel like you can carry forward and implement, right? The implementation plan gives you a practical framework and a critical path to get there. So essentially it's an Excel document that gives you something you can use as a document to track going forward. So it's designed to be a tool. Now, whether, how, and when you all as a city carry forward the recommendations is a question, as a decision and a process that will happen in lots of different ways through lots of conversations with the community, lots of deliberations from you folks sitting at the dais here, right? We can't force or compel implementation. You may not want us to. I don't think you would. We don't vote here, and I don't pay property taxes here. So, and I don't think I'd want to, honestly, looking at some of the demographics. But
You missed the assessor last week.
but so I can't guarantee implementation. But what I can say is because of our approach, we have a really good history of our clients carrying forward and implementing our recommendations because of how we frame them, because of how we communicate them, honestly, in a way that we try to make sure that the recommendations can be heard, and that's really important to us. So we hope you implement them. It's good for us. It's a good thing, but I can't guarantee it.
Please, yeah.
And if I could just add to that, I mean, we sort of heard a few of these, we heard about a few of these studies that have been done. You just reiterated that, and we've heard them over and over again. And so some of that sits here. You know, it's not on us. Our task was to create, analyze, and recommend based on those findings. But when you talk about trust, and I'm just saying this having been in that person's seat, but when you talk about trust, that accountability falls on you all as well. And so, you know, if you've got multiple studies where they haven't been acted upon, you know, what message have you sent to your city at the end of the day? And when will you act upon one of these studies? The benefit of a study and a laundry list of recommendations, regardless of where it comes from, is you have options. It doesn't mean that, and I said this earlier, the reason you do a study versus the city beside you is because no one shoe fits all cities. But not necessarily every recommendation that comes to you today, based on the analysis months ago, applies now. And it might be that you do some of a recommendation, all of a recommendation, or none of it. But you have 16, 17, you got options. You have options to decide where it sits with you all, and understanding too, when John talked about that wheel with the 6 R's, you know, the benefit is there's a roadmap. You know, you don't need an elephant all at once. You've got to figure out what that looks like based on your budget, based on priorities, things shifting, and go from there. And then you have the other study, the survey from your community. Priorities may have shifted at this point, but I do think at the end of the day, some of this rests with this body that tasks some consulting entity to go forth, analyze, recommend, and where does the implementation occur and with whom. And I think that ultimately is on you all. And I do just want to add, I know you made the comment about teachers, and, you know, you would never see that. You're right. But I would also say don't compare apples to something that's not a fruit.
Sure.
Because you're talking about public safety. The safety of your city rests here with you all on your shoulders. And what does that look like to ensure that not only that you can carry out the role of public safety with staffing, with minimal staffing, but what could it look like if you had additional personnel to go forth and do whatever those other priorities are as well? And you use teachers, so I'm going to come back to teachers. They're not working 24/7.
Some are. Some are.
Right. But you also have people who may be called out depending on the crisis at hand, depending on what happens in your city. There is a continuation of time where people are working and working. Mutual aid sometimes has to be called in. I just think that the dynamics when you look at public safety, that could be police, that could be fire, that could be EMS,
Sure.
that could be dispatchers, but look at them in a different vein, because the delivery of service is different.
I hear you on that, and I think I make the analogy both from a time-off perspective, a staffing perspective, but quite frankly, I work with teachers, and they're thinking about school shootings every day, right? They're thinking about the mental health crisis of kiddos, and they're on the front lines of the public safety struggle in similar ways. But I agree, the jobs are different. There's a distinction. There's a distinction to be made, of course. I don't have any further questions, but I do just want to thank you both for your presentation, and maybe this is a bit of ordering for the table as you're leaving the restaurant, but to your point, when you give the city the implementation guidelines, I think it's going to be important that there is a distinction, similar to the discussion we just had, a distinction made between implementation that falls within the executive branch's jurisdiction and that which falls in the legislative branch's jurisdiction. There is plenty, I think, that we could have been doing and could be doing to implement the past several reports that have come to us on public safety. And I think there is a distinction to be made about the responsibility of the executive branch, which ultimately sets the policy, right? They're the management. They set the policy for the police department. They set the policy for the other departments within the city. They decide what budget we review. So making sure that there is a distinction on those implementation tasks, but also making sure there are implementation tasks for this body. I think this body is hungry to implement some of these changes, and I think it's just what's the roadmap for the council to implement versus what's the roadmap for the executive to implement. So I've taken too much time. I'm a detailed person, but thanks again for being with us tonight. I might come back for a second bite of the apple, but probably not. But thank you.
Thank you.
Colleagues, let's take a brief recess. When we come back, we have Councilor Gomez-Milcott and Councilor Ewan-Campen. Let's take 10 minutes, and we'll come back at 9:05.
I'm not used to these.
All right, colleagues. Yes, please. Okay. Okay. Let's call this meeting back to order. Welcome back. Thank you. Next up, we have Councilor Gomez-Mocad, then Councilor Yoon-Kim, and then Councilor Scott.
Thank you to our chair here. I also want to thank your team for all this work. It's brought a lot of thinking to the process. I know it took a long time, but sometimes thoughtful thinking does take time. So I have a question. It's about the community service officers. Based on an experience I had with RSJ, with SPD, we based on when I first started office, perceptions of policing by the immigrant community, we brought them together to give us their feedback. And we're talking about sworn versus non-sworn officers. And one thing I kept on hearing from our immigrant communities is that, well, a sworn uniformed officer has an authority. It's important for that presence. They have a different perspective because, again, if you see our statistics, one of our largest immigrant populations are in Ward 1, and they're more exposed to crime. So I want to acknowledge that this side of the table is the least exposed to crime in our city, particularly my ward. So I acknowledge that, so I'm always trying to challenge myself in my way of thinking. The other thing I noticed, too, when we look at all the different models, Cahoots or SMART, and then the Providence, Rhode Island model you witnessed, if you looked at the populations, you know, both Denver and Eugene are 70 to 80% white. Once you go into Providence, Rhode Island, it's about 70% people of color. That leads you to believe, and that model has a hybrid model. So what I'm trying to say here is, how do you, I think it's important when you're looking at what's your perspective on community service officers and understanding when you're changing the model, there are folks who think safety has to be a uniformed person, whereas folks, others don't, and it might be because they have a different experience. So how do we make sure when we're creating this model that we are engaging those most affected and or getting their buy-in, just because this person isn't uniformed? Because sometimes we got to break the mold of what policing is and everything. But I think it's very important to have their buy-in. I would like your perspective on that. And that's my first question. Thank you.
Well, I would say you have an example like Cahoots in Eugene, Oregon, and it's been around for a long time. So they have been well established throughout what we're now seeing as a major mental health crisis in our country. They were already walking that walk. And then we hear reimagining, and you see a number of things. So in 2020, I remember folks saying, we'll just put social workers out there. They can answer the calls at 3 o'clock in the morning. There are some inherent risks in those types of scenarios. Usually at 3 o'clock in the morning, there is probably enough of a crisis going on that you might need law enforcement. It doesn't mean that you don't need a civilian out there, because civilians hold different roles in I'll just use as a crisis situation. They can be negotiators, they can be the counselors, they can be the trauma counselors, they can be a number of roles, and they can just be the people who are just trained enough in a capacity to get that person to a place where they can be helped with a staff of professionals. The hybrid models do often have sworn and a civilian person working in the same capacity. One may be in uniform, and it may be a different uniform than what is the traditional, uniform that you're used to seeing. It doesn't take away from the most obvious that they are law enforcement. But there's that partnership. Not only is that being done in a policing model, that's always also being done with first responders on the EMS side. You now see social workers on the trucks with the medical technicians and looking at how to address those mental health issues on the front end to get those people to where they can be helped in a much greater way. But being able to de-escalate and stop that situation long enough to get them to the help they need. This is where engagement with the community is key. This is where looking at the types of calls that you can prioritize in such a way that affords those community service officers or employees to respond and understand that an officer can respond to all of those calls because they've already been doing that. If you establish that it needs to be intentional and strategic, with tremendous planning, tremendous education, you just don't stand that up. You've got to communicate with your public in advance. This is where another opportunity to go forth into the community to say, here's what we've heard you. Here's what we're going to do. Here's how we're launching it. Here's why. Test it. Pilot it, evaluate it, determine whether or not that model works, decide whether or not it needs to be tweaked or expanded in some way. But this is where you have the opportunity to develop and design this. And when we talk about those best practices, there are best practices out there. There are national models where there are hybrid situations where departments and mental health practitioners, I'm just using that as an example, but where departments have reached out to those professionals in those spaces on the front end before any policy ever gets written, to get all of the subject matter expertise at the table to figure out, at the end of the day, how can we render a police service, but mental health practitioner, homeless shelter, domestic violence entity, how does our service supplement what you're already doing? And you remove that threat of those agencies thinking also that you're coming into their space to take over what they've been doing and are experts at, but working towards a whole different level of professional partnership. And then training, whatever that could look like, recognize that there are individuals who are professionally trained to train your people, so that they are going forward with the best possible tools that they can. And you build that on whatever, and in whatever capacity you choose. It can also look down the road as a monthly meeting or a quarterly meeting where all of these different professional entities come together to talk about what they're doing. Almost like justice centers. Are you all familiar with those? They're like the domestic violence center, but you have the social workers, law enforcement, judicial officials, somebody from the DA's office, domestic violence counselors, trauma counselor nurses, trauma nurses, all in the same space together. And then they not only work through the same cases, but then they meet on a regular basis to discuss those cases and what are the best steps going forward to ensure that that victim is advocated for on all levels.
I think, again, I asked this question because that's one of my concerns, that we implement one of these CSOs. I want to make sure that we're reaching out to those in the community most impacted, on who might have, it might be their culture, their experiences, might have one vision that some of us who live in a certain environment don't have. And you want that global buy-in. So I'm stepping down in a few weeks. I'll give an example. I'm part of this group, Padres Latinos, the Somerville Public School, and one of the things we were planning on at the coming year is to talk about the need for mental health services with trauma. Because some people, say, oh, well, I don't need that, or that's, hocus pocus or everything. So and some of these members of the community have come up to me and tell me one of the most places they've experienced most discrimination is in the healthcare system due to language barrier. So that's the other instances to understand is the importance of having, when we create this as CSO, what are the language needs? Because a language barrier can be a huge form of intimidation, and having that is, and I've seen it, again, I work at a hospital, and I've seen folks who are not tended fairly because of their language barrier, and although our healthcare system is becoming better at that. So I urge my colleagues to think of that perspective. It's not that we're anti-CSOs, it's that you have to make sure that those most affected have a buy-in, have a participation, because I know this is a community where we have very those with not so well off and struggling, and then we have a very more vocal community that might have more privilege, and I think there is good intent and balance, but to balance that out, we have to.
And if I could just add one other thing to this, we use the title CSO. Whatever titles you choose is solely up to you. The mission of that group or unit can be very different also. And so if you think about crime prevention, community relations, where are those underserved populations? And there again, this is where I think data helps everyone in telling your story. But do you have a community of folk who, unless there's a major crisis, they're never going to come to the police to begin with? But I'll just say your communities of color, if you have populations of immigrants, LGBTQ plus communities, this is an opportunity as well to figure out where your priorities are based on your community concerns, based on your city data, police needs. Where can you put the best footprint into that community to build those relationships, to build a bridge where those folk can trust you as city officials, your police department, and believe that they're valued regardless of their immigration status, regardless of the color of their skin, all of those things that I referenced earlier about fair and equitable policing, constitutional policing, fair treatment. This is that opportunity to create that unit that helps to push that mission forward. You just have to decide what it looks like.
And I also want to make another comment, because when we did the survey we discussed last week, our communities of color, brown and black, they're saying they want community policing. So they have a desire for that. So it's important to understand what that means to them as well, so in terms of engagement. Another comment question, I think there's a discussion of staffing for public safety. And it would be, I don't think it's clear, I think I have some understanding. I work in a hospital where it's 24/7 and you constantly have to have coverage. Even when I'm doing construction at night, I need to have a point person that's called. They have to be 24/7. I have to make sure person A, if I have a double shift, person A talks to B, there's an overlap of time, that information is passed on and all that. And I think it'd be good, I don't think what's clear here is that how that workflow operates when it's kind of a 24/7 operation, that whether it's health safety or general safety. And I think it would be good because unless you've worked in that environment, it's hard to comprehend. I come from a family of teachers, so I couldn't understand that until I worked at a hospital as well.
So just to give you some context, essentially at the beginning of every patrol shift, there's a shift briefing. During that briefing, the watch commander or the sergeant is going to, sometimes there's the same person, but typically it's going to be a lieutenant, is going to communicate the trends that have come through in reports, either through the investigative side or through the calls for service side, make sure that any relevant persons of interest, any relevant vehicles are being the officers are paying attention to it. So there's an initial shift briefing to make sure that there's an overlap from one shift to the other.
The other part is, I think, understand that you have to have sufficient coverage for a situation of crisis. So
Absolutely.
I can't, maybe the emergency room that day was empty, but next day I have an overflow. Mm-hmm. So I just can't call people out of the blue. Sometimes you do have on-call folks, different depending on the role they have, and a sociologist always has to be there. They sleep there. A radiologist can be on call because it's a different function. So I think it's important to understand that flow, because I know, again, having worked on that background, I think that's not clear, and I think anybody in the general public, of course they're going to say, well, how come you need that much if you have never worked on that? This is closer to a paramedic, what kind of coverage they have. Again, nursing staff in an emergency room, it's a different entity. So I think that would be a helpful thing to understand, because I myself was a little. And again, I also want to thank you. I think I spoke to you about the importance of diversity at the higher echelons. Really is a very important message to send. Because I think, I talked to you, I'm dealing with this in construction where we're asking the labor force, trades to have diversity, but we're not asking the higher levels. And that's another traditionally very undiverse so we're trying to change that, and I think it will give some levels of confidence. And one thing, talking to the immigrant population, I said, what do you want in an officer? And they're like, we want a friendly officer, but I think someone we can relate to too. So, and we do have some officers here that the community, there's a gentleman who's Brazilian who speaks Spanish and Portuguese, and he's a hit just for that reason.
Great.
So, thank you.
Thank you.
If I could just touch quickly on the comment you made about staffing, I think several of you have. But, as those of you who are the planners and the keepers of the budget, so to speak, this is also that opportunity to evaluate when situations happen now in your department and people need to stay over because there's not adequate staffing and they're paid the overtime. You have to look at where the efficiency model is in that type of practice as well. And is there an opportunity to ensure that you've got adequate staffing versus paying people at that price? And there may be times when there are events where you have no choice, but should that be your standard? Where you're paying the overtime because you don't have the staffing, because you're minimally staffed or lower, versus having the members available to do the work, to work the shifts, and to be paid accordingly.
Councilor Hinkibben.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I am just incredibly grateful to have an opportunity to talk about these issues outside the context of budget season, outside the context of a confirmation of appointment, something where we have a really time-sensitive, weighty decision in front of us. And I must say, my overall impression of this report and the presentation is, it's like the opposite of being gaslit, whatever that feeling is, of feeling kind of validated that things that this council has talked about, that our community has talked about for years, I feel are reflected very, very well in this report. Things around questions we've had about the staffing of the patrol model, the importance of establishing civilian oversight, the importance of moving to unarmed officer model, a public process for the body-worn camera policy implementation. A lot of things that we've talked about that it sometimes feels like we're looked at like we have three heads are really explained in a way that I think that all of the stakeholders in our community can kind of understand. And so I really appreciate that, and I'm glad, albeit it's a little late at night, so I'll try to be brief, but I'm glad that we have this opportunity. And I think, honestly, my substantive questions really are for kind of my fellow electeds and for the administration on what the next steps are and how we're going to do all this. But while we have you all here, I do have a couple questions. So one of the things that has kind of, it's a talking point that comes up a lot in our budget season, has to do with forced overtime and just the effect that has on public safety employees, police officers. So my reading of the report, it doesn't explicitly say, the staffing model we'll propose will fix that. But the implication seems to be that with the new staffing model, those issues could be addressed, reducing the number of patrol positions, for example. Through the chair, am I interpreting that correctly, that this is a staffing model that we believe will kind of do away with,
So I don't think there will come a point where because of the way the collective bargaining agreement is structured, frankly, where you're going to eliminate forced overtime. I think, again, I mentioned sort of leave patterns. When you build a staffing model and you're basing it on averages, it's spread out over a year, but there's going to be densities of periods of time where more folks are unavailable than not. That's going to drive overtime, right? There are going to be challenges there. So it's not going to fundamentally eliminate it. The big challenge there is making sure that you have essentially the staffing factor covered and those sort of positions to cover for leave during that period, and that you're not experiencing prolonged vacancies. Or just as important, workers' comp is a major challenge. It doesn't necessarily show up as a vacancy, as a position that's not filled, but it's a position that's not available to support the work that's required on a day-in-day-out basis. So those are really the things that are going to have the biggest impact on overtime, but you're always going to, in any police department, you're always going to have that pressure, because you can't, if we said staff to the peak leave usage period, you wouldn't like us very much, right? So, being able to kind of manage that peak, we can't really staff to that place. So you're always going to have the overtime number. I think what's incumbent is being really intentional about understanding what it is, where your peaks are, at what point is the threshold of how much you're paying? Does that tip over to say, well, maybe we need to add another position so that we're paying someone straight time instead of overtime or double time, right? So that's a management question, honestly, going forward, but it's a vacancy question more than anything to me.
Through the chair, I think that's really helpful, and there's a lot of new information that I'm going to need to learn more about. I often feel like the conversations around this that we'll have at large community meetings can be really superficial, where there's just folks who think if we hired 50 new officers, this problem would go away, and other people saying, no, there's a lot of nuance to this. So I think having this kind of information and then staffing report and learning more about kind of how workers' comp plays into it and the CBA, obviously, that's something that I look forward to learning more about.
And this is, if I could also add, this is where project and planning comes into. When you do your budget reviews on an annual basis, then you have that opportunity to look at your city's growth. What else is going on? Is there some major national event that's going to happen in 2 years here? How do you plan for that, where you may have the chief already planning and dealing with those partnerships and who's going to come in mutual aid-wise, but what else is there that the city has to consider for that continued growth, that expansion, and so forth, that sometimes those things just kind of pop up because nobody's been paying attention. So you have to look at all of that, but it doesn't mean that you have to staff everything at once. This is the benefit of that roadmap also, to just give you the leverage and the latitude to plan and look down the road and project for that growth and those shifts within the organization.
Through the chair, thank you. So I just have a couple more questions. We have experts in the room. So one of the conversations that's very live in this community is around when we do ultimately establish unarmed first response force, should those folks be located in the police department, outside of the police department? My reading of this report is it assumes they'll be in the police department. And my question through you is, what are the arguments that they should be in the police department?
So I think the access and ability to gain intelligence from police officers who are typically going to be those folks who have the greatest knowledge about what is or is not going on in the community. I think there is an advantage and benefit there. Does that mean you can't have positions that serve a similar function in other departments? It doesn't. But the connection that they have to their department then becomes something that has to be managed from a personal relationship perspective, right? They're also, and from a systems perspective, and that's a little bit easier to break down than hierarchical connections. Okay, so there's a value there. There are also inevitably going to be incidents where it's iffy, whether a CSO or an unarmed civilian position or a sworn position should respond, partly because there is only so much information that a dispatcher can really glean. And it is appropriate to take a risk-based approach and in some cases have mutual dispatch. So you want folks working under the same dispatch hierarchy, typically under a same supervisor who can make those decisions about where a broader response force is required versus an individual CSO. But again, it depends on the type of services being provided, right? If we're talking about traffic enforcement, or traffic flagging, maybe that's a different conversation. Maybe you have something in the public works space, and I don't know. I mean, there's variations that you can engage with. But having those two kind of sworn and non-sworn serving essentially the same calls, right? It's a call for service. It comes in through an administrative line or through a 911 call, right? Being a response force, you want a point of contact that can differentiate what's the thoughtful, risk-based approach to how you respond to protect officer safety, to protect civilian safety, and protect the safety of those requests in the call. So.
That's helpful. Through you, Madam Chair, I mean, I know the CAHOOTS program, I feel like every city in the country just talks about CAHOOTS. Mm-hmm. I know that they're carrying a lot of the burden of this conversation, but through you, is CAHOOTS part of the police department there? I know that they work in conjunction, but they're not, correct? Okay.
No, they're not.
Sorry, I have a very dumb question. It's about community policing, whatever the various terms are for it. It's something where I've heard the narrative of how important it is. Mm-hmm. There's a very compelling narrative in this report, and I don't question it, how it's important. It sounds to me like a huge part of the importance is the idea of, for officers, they don't want to have to be, not every interaction that they have should be in an incredibly intense, awful situation, right? You should also get to know the community in other contexts. There's benefits to that. You often hear stories that it can help with investigations, that they have ongoing relationships, et cetera. Those all make sense to me. I guess I'm honestly wondering if you could point me to evidence around this. I'm just thinking, when I joined the council, we had ward-based community officers, and this is not to denigrate those individual officers by any means, but I think if you asked my constituents, do you know who that person was, they would have said no. I mean, he was perfectly nice guy, public servant, but I don't think he had, I don't think that it served an enormous public safety benefit is my takeaway from that. And I wonder, where would I look to find evidence of that in addition to being a very compelling story, kind of we know for a fact it makes a huge difference.
Yeah, so what I'm hearing is where's the qualitative empirical data that supports community policing versus the qualitative story that's told, right?
Yes, and through you, I'm not doubting it exists. I'm ignorant of it.
I appreciate that. It's extremely difficult to empirically prove prevention. Right, that's one of the fundamental challenges. So, but what we also want to do is pay attention to community perception. And one of the things that you see, what you would want to see is your baseline community survey results, essentially, that you have now. You would want to see, as you implement community policing, you would want to see increases and improvements in some of the fundamental metrics that you're looking to improve. So, what you really try to capture in a systematic way, and departments that do this well, and there are many, try to really engage and measure that piece. So that's really, it's a community perception and measurement piece, right? So you also want to see ultimately fruitful results from intelligence-led policing activities. So you point to or look for, if you have a string of serial burglaries, you're using that data to inform a deployment approach, a patrol approach in particular areas where that individual may strike again, and having a collar or having an arrest in that space, right? So it tends to be incidental kind of demonstrations where it's effective. There's also just the relationship piece. So perceptions of trust in the community, again, that's really the primary measurement.
Okay. Through you, I just have one last question. Thank you for that. In the section on the civilian oversight, there's, I don't know if it's a recommendation explicitly, but the idea of maybe it would be better to start with a civilian oversight that is not empowered formally. And I wonder, through you, could you talk about the arguments for, I mean, what I've heard from the community is that they emphatically are skeptical of a civilian oversight board that has no formal authority, because what they do, right? They would, yeah, it's a headline, but what do they really do? What is the argument for kind of starting with a less empowered civilian oversight board?
There are pros and cons on both. There are pros and cons on both sides. Usually, the powers that are looked at are investigative powers, punitive powers as well, in addition to just general oversight. And I know that even in cities where there are no contracts with law enforcement, there's a concern about boards being able to designate penalties, punishment, discipline to staff. And one that would be, typically, that's the only staff in city government that would have that type of oversight. And we know that those boards are created for reasons that are unique to law enforcement to begin with. So typically, that's the disciplinary piece is the challenge. And this is why in the recommendation, the comment was about basically vetting those individuals so that you have subject matter experts on that board who understand and are willing to understand the overall dynamics of that police department, if that's the route you choose. There are some panels or boards that literally are oversight. So, for instance, the department issues the discipline, and that board looks to see if that was the proper discipline administered, why that officer or individual was disciplined, and so forth. Their power is very limited. There are other panels or boards where they do the investigation. Part of that clearly here is about contract, but it's also about where the limitations are are there statutory limitations in the state of Massachusetts that would regulate what a board empowered in any capacity can do? So this kind of lends itself to the comments I made about body-worn cameras, is when you go into that, be intentional, but be strategic in what that looks like for your city, and ensuring that there has been conversation and dialogue, intentional conversation and dialogue with your community as to what those expectations are, and how you're able or willing to deliver those expectations. There have been some boards that have been created where there's been recreations and reiterations because the first grouping was not necessarily the focus that the city or that government, body of government was looking for, and looking at term limits and how the evolution happens, how many you have. Are there, as I mentioned, are there certain areas of expertise you want these people to represent? There's a lot that goes into it, and very often, though, you'll hear from the community that this is what we demand and this is what we want. But you all, as that governing body, are accountable for ensuring that that equity is addressed on both sides of that coin as well. Your staff here, as well as the community that you're serving as well. And it is a delicate balance. But there are departments that have those places, those entities in place. There are departments who have had to have those entities in place because they may be under a consent decree. There are different reasons how those boards have evolved, and the powers that be with those boards are different in every municipality as well. So that's where that research and being intentional about what you want and how you want to move forward with that is important.
Through you, Madam Chair, I'm all set. I wanted to thank you both for being here. I think this report really, really kind of makes me optimistic, and I think, as we've discussed, the onus is now on us, as elected officials, to move this stuff forward. Thank you very much.
Councilor Scott.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to thank everybody tonight for the excellent questions, and of course for our presenters and consultants here. I just wanted to jump back to a statement that was made earlier. I think I heard that the analysis and results of the study were complete in March of 2023. But that the results were held until now because of a community engagement process. Did I hear that correctly?
We completed our preliminary analysis from March to March, essentially. So okay. March 2022 to March 2023, completed our preliminary analysis. Before we finalized any analysis and recommendations, we made sure that the survey and focus group process was well underway so that we could have use that information to inform if there were any adjustments to the recommendations, which there were not.
Excellent. But you got ahead of me on my follow-up. So March of 2023, and then 8 months. 8 months later, we're getting. So you're saying that none of the conclusions or recommendations were changed based on that?
Correct.
Okay. Okay, and that was the public engagement process being run by the Department of Racial and Social Justice?
Correct,
okay,
yes.
Great. All right, I have so many thoughts. First, I just want to say I think this report and the work done by y'all definitely deserves praise. Particularly, I think, as my colleague at large noted, for the transparency with which you published the data that you based certain math and conclusions on. I also appreciate repeated acknowledgments. Chief Deck Brown made that what's vital is that this body and that this city make policy decisions based on this information to reflect this community's needs and values. I think it's not beyond the realm of the reasonable to disagree or to have a difference of opinions with the conclusions that might have been reached or even might be recommended in that roadmap. Based on the policy priorities we each have or our constituents have. I am a little, I'm looking at the forward track of those conversations because I'm old enough to have been here a while in this chair and remember policy discussions of the past. And I know that we do have several new members joining this council soon. You know, we had about 48 hours to look at your 52-page report. And I know that I have so many questions, several of which have already been asked, but, you know, those answers require a certain amount of digesting and work on it. So I guess maybe to you or through the chair or to the president, are you going to be available to continue to help this council process or, you know, interrogate some of the conclusions or the methods or models that went into this report, or is this our only chance to get you to ask y'all questions?
So we don't have any additional scope or budget built into the project. So once the implementation plan is delivered, that's the conclusion of our role.
Okay. And remind me what the date was on that? On the implementation plan coming in.
It's already drafted. We wait to send it until after this meeting, so it'll come next week.
Oh, this week. All right.
Next week. I said next week.
Well, Madam Chair, I don't know how much engagement you got to have with this process. I know I had one lovely interview early on, as they indicated, with the city council. City councilors made it available to all city councilors. And as much as I do my best to rely on the published information, I'm also, I can look at a historical record of published information. It doesn't change. It doesn't change for the context that can be brought out in a conversation there. So I hope that I can take advantage of the next week to call and ask y'all questions about some of these things. And if you got to send a bill to the mayor, please send a bill to the mayor.
We don't charge for phone calls.
Oh, well.
There's a time limit on those phone calls.
I was going to say, be cautious about not putting any limits on that. All right, so I guess my concern is just that these policy discussions are going to be ones that I think deserve, at the very least, to have our two newest colleagues who will be joining this board participate in. I think it's... I hate to say that it's, news dropped late on a Friday before a holiday weekend that gets buried in the news cycle, but here we are coming into the end of the year in the middle of the holiday season here, and as much as I'm glad that it was only delayed 8 months in getting to us, I question at this point what another month retaining these services and properly welcoming our colleagues into these discussions and the value that might have. And it's also just because I have a lot of questions, Madam Chair. I'm struck. The mathematical analysis, I think Councilor Kelly brought up on page 21, indicating something that Ward 5 counselor, the former Ward 5 counselor, that is, respectfully, Councilor Niedergang, said multiple times in this chamber during his tenure about the SPD being overstaffed on the overnight shift. And he had worked as an analyst in the police department prior to becoming a city councilor. He probably had more familiarity with the police department than anybody else who sat around this horseshoe. And so I definitely have questions about what the nature of a severe incident response, because I believe if I read that correctly, there was you advised against having any reduced staffing on that overnight shift where there's less demand, and certainly I would think less of that community policing where you're getting those on the street interactions with people. Mm-hmm. But that there was a need to maintain all of those personnel overnight because of the possibility of a severe incident response. Is there is there a defined term, I guess, as my colleague had been asking about what a severe incident response is, about the frequency of that, about the concern there?
Imminent threat to life or property
Imminent threat to life and property.
is essentially the framework you would think of it as. But you also, so the other thing that you have to consider is really response times, right? So although traffic, hopefully, at 3 o'clock in the morning, right, is less of an impact, the density, the transportation network here, the time it takes to get from one call to the other is also a fundamental question. Officer safety and support is another fundamental question, right? So making sure that over the night shift, even though you have far fewer calls for service, you also have the need to much more actively patrol, because the more severe incidents and the higher levels of crime are typically going to occur during that period as well. So we would not recommend reducing your capacity on those hours because there's fewer calls for service, because of the geographic layout, officer safety concerns, critical incident issues, and response times.
All right, well, I appreciate that. I think there's probably a lot more depth and texture we could go in with that discussion. I appreciate it. Again, I think this is one of those things that I look forward to some conversation, but I remember very clearly some of the scorn that Councilor Niedergang's conversation and discussion of these facts met with at the time. I think within the context of our city's extensive partnerships with extramural agencies, right? Department of Homeland Security, Immigration, ICE, right? UASI, our Urban Area Security Initiative, I'm sure you're familiar, or even extra-legal affiliations like NIMLEC, for those who might not be aware, it's a New England private law enforcement consortium that we participate in. That they're shockingly opaque. You can't even make records requests of them. They claim to be exempt. But we participate, and it's part of those mutual aid networks you talk to. And so I guess as I think about the staffing overnight levels and that whole policy discussion, I would really appreciate, of course, having your expertise as, a longtime chief and just the expertise of your team. So I'm hopeful, I guess. Perhaps I'll direct this to my colleague, the current council president, to say that perhaps we can prevail upon our mayor to have some of these expert resources remain available to us as we engage in some of these policy discussions moving forward. I think at the very least our once and former colleague, or once and future colleague, Councilor Mba, and our new councilor from Ward 5 certainly deserve access to your expertise.
Can I just add something real quick? And I don't know that was the direction you were going, but I just think for the sake of saying at least, because sometimes this does happen, when you talk about mutual aid, that's not an area that you can rely on, because those jurisdictions that you are seeking assistance obviously are having whatever issues they have to take care of as well. So it's usually those critical events that warrant, and sometimes it could be staffing, but that can't be what you rely on for the safety of your city. So, from a staffing standpoint, yes, if you had a major situation, they may come from all points around you, but that's not every situation. And when you talk about relationships and partnerships, usually those mutual aid agreements come by way of contract. And they stipulate what justifies a response into your city under whatever those circumstances are. So sometimes it's assumed, well, we've just got neighboring cities, we'll just call them. But be mindful of wearing out your welcome is sort of a southern colloquial phrase, but don't wear out your welcome in that space. Be strategic about what that looks like.
Chief, if I was in danger of wearing out my welcome, I probably did that years ago here. I would say that you're speaking my language, though, when you talk about the contracts that bind these mutual aid networks. The contract with NIMLEC is one that I had a great deal of interest in, because it's one of those mutual aid arrangements where we can make a phone call and somebody shows up with an armored vehicle and a SWAT response team within our city that, It has a point of being some concern, but I don't want to waste everybody's time going into the contracts. One question that I wanted to ask that just struck me off the jump was about managerial structure. There was a slide that said the organizational structure is appropriate. So what is a good ratio of supervisory, not to take it back to teachers and students ratio, but supervisory officer to patrol officer?
So if you're looking at the patrol space, it used to be years ago, you might say it's 1 to 7 or 1 to 9 or some number along those lines. With adjustments in policing, with increased scrutiny, with the greater risk, with the need for supervisors to be much more intentional.
Greater risk of what? Through the chair, my apologies.
So just the greater risk of perceptions of issues, right? Basically the fundamental nature of policing, the fundamental increased scrutiny, the fact that historically some of the issues that have become public issues are because of the absence of effective supervision. So if you go back and look at the after-action reports, if you really look at what some of the fundamental things that lead to some of these systematic issues, it's supervisory issues. It's the absence of consistent supervision. It's stretched supervisors. So the span of control is shrinking. Right? At least the recommended span of control. I would say, at 1 to 6, you all are okay now. If you start expanding, if your community continues to grow, you may have to start looking at adding additional supervisors. So that supervisor to subordinate at the patrol space is one answer. Now, if you look on the investigative space or you look at command space, it may be different. It depends on what the individual specialized tasks of that position may be. So, folks, the sort of the general term is it a working supervisor? Yeah. So, and there's different definitions of that. But there really isn't a number that I would point to and say, make sure it's 1 to 10, or make sure it's 1 to 5. It really depends by the individual unit. And what we really did is look at what are the tasks that each of these positions are engaged in? What do we feel like based on that workload and based on their supervisory, what is reasonable for them to control, to supervise? Are there any adjustments we need to make there? So.
All right. Well, I appreciate that. I also appreciate the call out of the 1 to 7 number because that is something that has shown up in some of those historical.
It's a common number, and it's a good number. I mean, if you're going to pick one number to hang your hat on, that's the middle of the road. But if you're in a job that it's repetitive tasks, right, very consistent, you can be 1 to 15. But if you're a job that requires consistent exercising of independent judgment on multiple tasks, you need to shrink that down. So
it's like in our investigative, sometimes there'll be a lieutenant, a sergeant, and 1 detective or 2 detectives. It's a very high ratio of supervision.
Yeah, because there's also an investigative caseload.
Sure.
For those supervisors.
Understandably. So I guess, but you said, it's shrinking. The span is shrinking. We might be looking at 1 to 6 or 1 to 5. And I guess that's what jumped out to me is that right now we've got 13 senior patrol officers, lieutenants and sergeants, and 46 patrol officers, presumably 46, recommendation of 43. We're talking about a ratio there closer to 3 to 1.
So we've made recommendations around desk officer positions. You also have watch commander roles. You have sergeant roles. You have multiple teams that you have to staff because of the 24-hour structure, right? So there's a number of other factors that go into simply looking at the aggregate ratio.
Yeah, I mean, again, you smeared out across an entire year. Everybody wants to take their leave around Thanksgiving. I get it. It's just one of those things that jumped out. And again, to my point that I made earlier, I would love to have several hours to get into the weeds with you on it, or at least for us to have those conversations and then to make a presentation so that my constituents can understand why it looks like there are better ratios there, more brass-heavy organization, even than some of the police officers I hear from understand. So, although I do appreciate your comment about the greater risk comes from increased public scrutiny and transparency, people actually seeing what's happening. Although I would say based on the city of Somerville's particular history of losing lawsuits for police discrimination and violence, many times that's on the superior officers rather than the rank and file. All right, so I guess I'm also curious. I've got some notes here. And I really appreciate the line of questioning about that 30% overage, and I think that's one that I would also like to dive into a little bit more deeply. And I also appreciate one of my colleagues brought up, and it was acknowledged that we have these older surveys, these 2001, 2004 report, and the fact that, many of those recommendations, the civilianization of officer positions, removal of the mayor's driver, realignment of staff, diversification of force and management, low morale of staff, dissatisfaction with city and department leadership. Yeah, absolutely. Lack of civilian oversight. And I agree that it is not your role and not your fault that you're here 20 years later getting paid to tell us the same things we were told 20 plus years ago. So I am hopeful, though, since I can't talk to the folks that did those reports 20 years ago, that I'll have the opportunity to work with you, and that our residents will get the benefit of their elected representatives getting to engage with you to help us as we work on these policy questions, because I really do think that is where we need to do our work as a council. I've had 6 years now working on the city's budget, trying to get my constituents and neighbors the services and supports they need, from streets to sewers to schools to housing to food, right? And 6 years being told also that I can't possibly understand the needs of our current city and department without another consultant report, that the reports of 2001, the reports of 20 years ago are irrelevant, and it's hard for me to take that seriously when I have another report saying many of the exact same things. So that is the work that is going to be on our council and on my colleagues as we go into a new year to hopefully take some action and require action where it's not ours to take. So I have so many other thoughts, but the hour is late, as my old colleague Bill White used to say. So I'm going to yield and hopefully work with the chair and the president to see what we can do with the mayor's office to get to ensure some of these resources are available in the new year. Thank you once again.
Councilor Brindley.
Thank you to the chair and also through the chair. Thank you for coming down here. We don't get a lot of visitors in City Hall. I always love seeing people who aren't my colleagues, no offense to my colleagues, in this chamber. I'm going to try to practice gratitude, at least to start in our conversation. I'm happy to have this document before us, and I think it's really important that we contextualize it as a piece of an overall public safety infrastructure strategy that relies upon several different things. One of you made the note about when it comes to traffic enforcement, that the literal structures of the street are one element that I would say is quite important when it comes to ensuring that road users are operating in a safe way. And I see this as similarly placed as one specific component. I think it's important that we raise up the fact that safety, public safety, and policing are not synonyms. The attempting to conflate them, I think it's I think it's dangerous, quite frankly, but it's also just inaccurate. But this, I'm going to kind of go beyond to those bounds shortly, but while we're operating within those bounds, while we're focusing on this report, which is very crucially focused on SPD effectiveness, efficiency, perception, I think there is some really good data points in here and some recommendations that I really do encourage the mayor to take up. I found the 911 dispatchers component of this report helpful. The idea that we're not calculating or timing how quickly these calls are being answered, I think is just from a data or best practices lens faulty. We want to know that we're as quickly as possible responding to residents in crisis, sending out the best suited individuals to comfort them and to make sure that they're safe. Additionally, moving beyond the ward-based model for patrols, I think is a worthwhile consideration that, again, I think has been brought up before, but I think to Councilor Scott's point by Councilor Niedergang here. But I think it is very much worth discussion. I also just want to raise for our constituents that a lot of these recommendations are subject to collective bargaining. These are not recommendations that, most of them are not recommendations that the council can just say, this is a great idea, let's do that, let's pass a law. These are things that need to be worked out directly with SPD, and I encourage our mayor to get into those conversations. I do want to note that along a similar line, while there are, I think, very important and helpful data points here, recommendations, the lessening of reliance on administrative officers who, while we could be having folks doing the job that I think the public imagines police to be doing, the more critical safety functions rather than paperwork, I think is quite important. But overall, I do want to just raise that this conversation around reimagining policing. As one of the constituents who was here in 2020, who did sign on with thousands of other residents to ask for not reimagining policing, but moving to an alternative model of dealing with emergencies and enhancing the sense of public safety for residents who do not feel comfortable with police. I do want to just name that this framing around we got to make the police department have a better relationship with the community, have more robust programming in this area or that area. For me personally, it does miss the mark. That's not shade toward your firm to this report. I believe you had a very specific and narrowly focused aim with this report, and I think it was done quite expertly and again with incredible attention to detail. Having said that, the fact that alternatives to policing are effectively not in this report, I think it's quite concerning. I mean, when we look at the report that we heard last week that's been referenced by several councilors, that was a request from our public repeatedly in that report. And in fact, when asked how to enhance the feeling of safety, I believe was in multiple cases the #1 request. And yet, when one of my colleagues asked about the CSO positions and whether they would live within the police department or outside of it, we're back in this conversation about, well, we can have unarmed people within the police department who are officers who, still, you may not be sworn, may not have a gun, but for all intents and purposes are cops in potentially just everyday uniform. For me personally, that just does not meet the demands of our constituents. It's not what we were asked to do, it's not what we were asked to focus on, and in that respect, I think we really should be doing better. We really should be, and this is not on you, this is on the council and on the administration. We really should actually focus on what people ask us to focus on rather than nibbling at the edges or reshuffling policing and saying this department should shrink while this department should grow. That may be true, that might be helpful in some respects, but again, it does not get to the overall function of policing. It does not get to the question of how do we enhance people's ability to seek help and to feel more safe when they do not feel comfortable calling the police. Them having a property detective who's doing important work doesn't necessarily do anything for that person who is still seeking help outside of those bounds and needs someone who can talk to a person experiencing mental health crisis, someone who may be going through substance use disorder, someone who just needs a wellness check. And I was glad to see the words wellness check in this report and to see it listed under the CSO, which I think is a valuable concept, but would actually meet the needs of this community better outside of the bounds of the police department, as it has been repeatedly requested, both in the report we heard last week, as well as in our budget cycle this year, in our budget cycle last year, and the budget cycle before that year. And I do want to just note, in regards to this proactive policing, community policing, a phrase I think is broadly an unhelpful term because it's a definition that is amorphous, changes with who we're talking to, is your point. I appreciated that at the very least in this report, it seems that you went to great lengths to express that it's important that this city determine what that looks like here. That we're not just saying community policing. What does that mean? No one really knows, but do it. But instead, figuring out what best practices look like for Somerville. One of the examples that was used in this report was from Mount Vernon, Illinois, a place I've never been to. But the example that was used was about proactive policing being used to determine also when not to send police, when it might be counter to the goals of good community relations to send police. And I think that was, quite frankly, a very helpful example, because I think when we operate as a city thinking that everything is a nail, we become hammers all the time. Every public safety issue becomes, well, let's make the police do it, which is, quite frankly, a lot of how we got to where we are today in the overall landscape of policing and public safety. I think there are some really important questions that the city should ask itself based on this reporting, and in one part of the report you laid out, which is just the question that I think you wrote, the question that SPD needs to ask itself is, what does the community want community policing to look like? And what does the community not want community policing to look like? And I just want to raise up that year after year we've heard the requests by hundreds, or in some cases thousands, of residents to build up a program, a department, some kind of institution that can give residents the option to seek support from their city that does not involve law enforcement. This report is not the place to seek that answer, because again, it is narrowly focused on the effectiveness, efficiency, and overall structure of Somerville Police Department, which is, again, totally fine goal. But I really, really hope we get to a place where we actually start answering the question that started this process in the first place. And I feel pretty confident to contextualize that, because I was a part of that initial process. And some of the notations in this great report, it does at one point have a footnote to Defund SPD's website, which I appreciated because I helped write that website. And I really, really hope the city takes seriously the repeated, frequent, manifold requests upon us to treat the demands of our residents seriously instead of trying to work around them and then release a press release about it. Thanks.
Councilor Clean.
Oh, thank you, Madam Chair. I don't have any questions, but since we're making comments, I just figured I would make a comment. First of all, your report stinks. You guys really did a terrible job. No, I'm kidding. You did the job you were supposed to do. I appreciate that. That was what was in the scope, was a staffing study, and as been noted, some of these recommendations were made before, and previously other administrations or whoever didn't implement those. I look forward to those discussions. As the Ward 4 counselor, I feel I appreciate the sort of the look at the ward by ward policing, which I never really took as being like the officers were bound to their ward. I know they back each other up. So I guess my point is that I always just thought of it as in terms of, I always have a problem with, if you break it down to numbers, you're talking like 12,000 people per ward. If we had, God forbid, an incident in every ward, that's one, that's one officer per ward. Again, and being in customer service as long as I have, I know that you can never, you can never be, it's fail to plan to fail type of situation. You never know what's going to happen. And the idea that, I'm glad that you said to keep the 6 on the second half of the overnight, because I would really hate to be caught in a jam whereby we didn't have enough officers to keep our folks safe. So thank you for that, and thank you for the work that you've done, and that's it.
Thanks, Councillor. Before we do any round twos, I have a couple questions. I'll keep them brief. The implementation plan that you've been mentioning is. I don't want to make assumptions about it. Is it going to be based on the data that was collected over that 1-year period, or are there any adjustments you're making to base it on current realities? And I'll give you one example, because as you mentioned, I think, Cassandra, things have changed or shifted, right, since some of the initial data collection. In the report, it mentioned that the Community Outreach and Affairs Unit was vacant at the time of the analysis. But my understanding is it's staffed. It's staffed now?
I think they're starting to staff it, yeah. So,
right.
We will get, with each recommendation, there'll be a list of key implementation steps. Could be 5, could be 10, depending on, so what's the sequence to implement that recommendation. You may already be in process of implementing it or well on your way. That won't change ultimately what the implementation steps look like. So we won't go back and revise. Again, we're giving it to you as a draft document to take and own as a community, as a city, for the administration to use going forward to track implementation. So whatever status update or the status of the recommendation now, whatever implementation has occurred, can be reflected in that document in the comments section.
Great, thank you. My next question is about, I'm on page 26. The recommendation about creating a community service officer unit, and it's the way in which it intersects with the core team. So if we decide to move forward with the creation of the CSO unit, I'm just reading from the report, it can build on the foundation of its core team and figure out how it could interface with core to ensure community members in crisis get both short-term and ongoing support. Can you share if you've seen this model work effectively in other places as kind of like interface between a CSO team and what we have as core, which is an after response model, and how that intersection has worked successfully successfully?
Yeah, so the after response model or there's a co-response model as well. The co-response model, coincidentally, is much more labor intensive to implement. Typically, it will often when you send a police officer with a mental health professional, there's a much longer period for the initial assessment of the call, and typically there's a much longer period with which that officer and that CSO is drawn away to help direct and divert that person to the services they require. So it can often turn a 40-minute call into a 6-hour call, which is one of the challenges with the system. So that's there are ways to do it both ways, right? Now, whether you can expand, CORE to offer alternatives, to offer enhanced services, I would really tap in to the really well-led unit, honestly, around what the opportunities are. So I think this is really one where you all can define your priorities. You have a great infrastructure in place. The CORE process and program is, I would say, a best practice that you all should be pretty grateful for. I think it's a great program, and I think it gives you a really good foundation with a lot of lessons learned, with some tremendous expertise in that space, that I think gives you a jump start to be able to expand mental health programming or diversion programming.
Thank you. Go ahead.
I could just add from a personal note, that was one of the last projects I implemented before I retired, was a co-response model. And I've been gone a year and a half. The new chief has expanded it. Council supports it. It is a social worker and a police officer. The benefit, and it can be a drawback, but I know it sounded very cliche when I said the world's your oyster, but because you have the opportunity to develop this the way that it fits your city. So that program in Raleigh is expanding. It just made a national magazine, the Police Executive Research Forum, the PERF magazine. It's an article in there. And while, if you design it in such a way that you can't spend that kind of time, then that does create a challenge. But if it's designed in such a way, depending on what that care response looks like, that works to your advantage as well. We actually established a site separate and apart from all of my station houses. So they are in a separate building by themselves, but it's police and social workers working together. That was the model that worked for our city, because I could not see sending a social worker out there at 3 o'clock by themselves. There again, you have the opportunity to evaluate what that looks like and what services you provide.
Thank you. My last question is one of my favorite topics. I say this facetiously on this council, 'cause it's Groundhog Day, how often we talk about it, but crossing guards, which currently sit in the police department. We have a major challenge around recruitment of crossing guards, and it's not just a Somerville problem. One of the recommendations is on civilianizing the supervisor and safety officer position, but there isn't much else in the report about crossing guards specifically as a position, whether or not they should live in the police department, whether or not we've seen more effective models outside of the police department in other communities. Can you speak at all to that?
There are departments, I cannot tell you one right off, but there are some departments that contract completely with a school crossing supplier, if you will, where that entity contracts with the police department and has the sole responsibility of staffing those locations and doing all of that. I don't know which departments. I know that at some point, I recall looking at it. There's a cost factor that comes with that. And, what comes with that also is whether you do it internal or external, there's a cost factor of equipping those folk, uniforming those folk, et cetera. And that's where you have to do the cost analysis, really, to see where the greater benefit is for your organization based on the number, what they're paid, that supervisor, sworn supervisor oversight, and so forth. But there are companies out there that provide the staff, and the jurisdictions contract with those companies.
Gotcha. All right, we'll go to round 2 for my colleagues, which I know Councilor Wilson wants to kick us off.
Thanks, Chair. Second bite of the apple. I held off on asking most of my questions about what was in the report the first time around, but it's late, so I'll be selective here with what I ask. And I'll credit Councilor Kelly with inspiring me to go look up page numbers here tonight to help our clerk pull up the correct part of the report on the screen. I want to start on page 6. With a general question, if you could just quickly explain, like, why we keep hearing the 88, and that's the number budgeted. The approved number, I believe, is 94. 88 patrol officers. We've seen a bunch of different numbers today. We see 46 as the current number of patrol officers. How do we account for that discrepancy between what our budget tells us and what the org chart and what this tells us?
So authorized versus funded, I think, is the way to think about it, right? So you can have positions that are authorized, but what's actually funded in the budget are often two different numbers. When you look at the number of 46 versus 88, I'll just throw those numbers out. I'm actually not sure what it is today, right? But what we're talking about with the 46 number are patrol officers. The larger number is sworn officers.
Through the chair, so the number of budgeted patrol officers is definitively 88, I can tell you that. The number of authorized is 94. So we are budgeted for 88.
Okay, is that a statement?
That is a fact.
Okay, great.
So I guess I'm wondering, how do we go from 88, I see at one point in the org chart, 55 officers listed in patrol, 7 officers in community outreach and affairs. How do we go from 88 down to these lower numbers?
Because patrol is a portion of the overall sworn staffing. There's investigative personnel, there's other specialty and command personnel, there's supervisors.
So through the chair, my understanding based on that then is you're saying people with the job title patrol officer are serving other functions in other units in that org chart.
I'm really, so there's captains, there's lieutenants, there's sergeants, there's patrol officers. I guess I'm not understanding the distinction in the question you're asking.
Through the chair, I would love to hear what Chief Femino has to say about this.
Chief Femino. Can you use the mic, Chief? Can you use the mic, please?
Through the chair, the 88 authorized funded positions, when we're talking about the 46 or the 51, whatever number, those are the patrol officers that are primarily assigned to the patrol cars. The rest of that number, the difference between that number are patrol officers that might be in the detective bureau or the traffic bureau. So it's the total number of officers, patrol officers.
Through the chair, thank you. That was my guess that they were in other units. Thank you for confirming that. A budget-related question, based on that same page. We talked about our E911 operators. Those are listed as part of the communications and records team, and animal control officers listed as part of the community engagement and special operations unit. Both E911 and animal control have their own budgets and are separate from the police budget. Is there any reason we couldn't also do this for the crossing guards who aren't even listed in the org chart under the traffic unit but are mentioned in the text as being part of that unit?
In terms of how it's reflected in the report, no. I mean, you can reflect it however you choose.
Through the chair, that might be a question for the ether, possibly for folks putting together the FY25 budget. Through the chair, jumping to page 9, is the only discrepancy between authorized and funded staff positions the 6 patrol officer positions we just discussed that were contingent on this report, ironically, that were cut from the FY23 budget and not even included in the FY24 budget. So the total authorized head count of 165.5 would translate to 159.5 total funded positions currently. And then through the chair, that might be one for the chief as well.
Yeah, I can't answer the question about where in the current budget.
Chief Emino.
Through the chair, could you just repeat the question?
So the report talks about these, basically we have this 94 authorized, 88 patrol officers funded. I'll just ask you, through the chair, are you aware of any other positions that are authorized and not funded that would be included in that 165.5 head count listed in this report?
Not that I'm aware of.
All right. Thank you for that. Through the chair, when the public hears calls for service, they're generally going to take those to mean calls to police 911 and non-emergency lines. So what defines a call for service for a proactive call, to say a directed patrol? The y-axis on that chart on page 11 tells us we've had over 30,000 of these calls in some recent years, but in the presentation that you gave us tonight, that was basically presented us in terms of patrol officer hours instead. I'd just love to know what a call for service for a directed patrol is actually defined as.
So everything is recorded in the CAD system as a call for service. So if there's an officer-initiated activity, it's still recorded. It's just not initiated via a 911 call or an admin call. So you can think of it as proactive or officer-initiated time. It's time absorbed on a dedicated, focused area, similar to what it would be if they were responding to a calls for service. So it's just, there just isn't a 911 call that starts it.
So let's just say that 911, there's an emergency, officer responds. That's a reactive call. Someone called 911, the officer responds. Let's say that there has been some concerning activity going on in one of your city parks. And during roll call, watch commander says, let's keep an eye on the park. We know that incidents have been occurring about this time of the day, etc. Proactive is, I've got some time where I'm going to go and check on things in the park. I will get out on the call, however it's coded, park security, whatever. I may ride around, I may get out and walk and meet and greet the people depending on the time of the day it is. That's me taking the initiative to go forth based on what the watch commander said, based on crime analysis and other issues to try and make an impact in the community. That's a proactive call.
Through the chair, I appreciate that. That was my suspicion. I appreciate you confirming that for me. Last question I had here on page 14 with the clearance rates. Overall property crime clearance rate shows an upward trend, but on page 15, part 1 property crime clearance rates, that's arson, burglary, larceny, theft, motor vehicle theft, have been generally trending down prior to the feds retiring that part 1 classification in 2021. I guess my question is, what property crimes have been getting solved here such that the overall property crime clearance rate is going in the opposite direction?
I don't know that I could answer that question here without diving into the actual specifics of the data, so I can't answer it off the cuff, but.
All right, through the chair then, I'll just say I was really glad to see this report recommend reforming the ward-based beats for patrol officers, civilian oversight, a civilianization of some roles within the police department, alternative emergency response in some fashion. And I was really glad to see morale addressed in the report. I believe it's one of the biggest problems that we face here in the city with our police department. We've seen a large number of lateral transfers requested to a neighboring city. And I'll just say, if we want a police department with values in line with ours as a community, we need to make sure that we're recruiting the best and retaining them. And the alternative is terrifying in terms of who could end up policing our city if we're not doing that. So I just want to thank you all for the work you and your colleagues put into this. And thank you for presenting to us tonight and staying here late with us.
You bet.
Councilor Gomez-Molgan.
I have a quick question because I think we're all getting a little worn out. This is to Chief Deck Brown. So you talked about a community service, a CSO model you did in your own city where the social workers and police work jointly. Can you, and there's a lot of talk about community access, but the one thing I didn't see in here is the importance, and that has been my frustration sometimes in council when we talk, and I've been shushed for saying this, but I think it's important to talk to, can you say how you engage the social workers who have been out on the street in this process, giving their input, folks who actually have worked? How do you bring different entities together to engage and talk? Is there a model that you used in your own community? Because that will be a key process here, is to, even if it's the CSO act separately, eventually there's a time they need to interact, so it's very important. Anybody who has a management background understands that integration is incredibly, sitting people together in advance is incredibly important, and listening to the different perspectives. So any feedback you can give in that will be very helpful.
Yes, so this started in the middle of the pandemic. We, like many other cities, you began to see, in the state of North Carolina, the governor's executive order, like many cities, was to shelter at home. Well, those who don't have a home are left on the street. And what we began to also witness was just an overall rise in mental health crisis calls, more and more throughout the week. With police response, de-escalation, but more and more of those types of calls. So looking at the data, pulling and really being intentional about crime analysis and trying to have a vision of how do we resolve this in some way. And there's risk that comes with that from leadership. In terms of stepping into a space you haven't stepped in. That's what reimagining looks like, is being able to step somewhere and provide that service, and sometimes doing that in a co-op way with others. And so once we looked at our own data, we realized this was, and I have a social work minor, but we realized this was not necessarily our skill set. So we convened meetings, many meetings, with folk who had the expertise. Those folk who are overseeing shelters, who are overseeing the needs of the homeless community, who are the mental health practitioners, and numerous meetings and conversation about what our thoughts were going forward, and sort of just kind of throwing it out there to see if there was an appetite. And we heard a lot of things. We heard a lot of support, but we also got some pushback about, why would you do this? This isn't your space, and so forth. And then having a lot of intentional one-on-one calls and conversations with those directors in those spaces. I did that as well. And I had a team that did it with other team members, but I also did it also. I reached out, I had those conversations, the lunches, the dinners with other folks. And then when we were set in policy, procedure, that kind of piece, we invited those same folk to help us formulate what that policy needs to look like. And then we also had to look and see, what kind of equipment do we need? Are there certain vehicles that will allow us to go forth into a homeless camp and set up a table and work with the consumers of whatever service we had? And then being intentional about advertising for it. for those positions, and inviting those stakeholders, those practitioners to come to the table and be a part of the interview process. Help us pick the best candidates for these spaces. And then continue to develop and seek those same professionals to provide training in those capacities as well. And then just building on to that relationship and partnership, but also in our co-response model, choosing and having the right people on the sworn side to be the co-response participants as well. You've got to be intentional about the people you put in those seats and what their interest is and why they have an interest in being a part of that team. And ultimately, making that presentation before the elected officials and seeking support.
Thank you. Any other questions? Okay. Jonathan and Cassandra, thank you so much for being here with us tonight and walking through the report and answering all of our questions. We really appreciate the time and energy you spent in our amazing city. Safe travels home. And with that, if there are no objections, colleagues, Mr. Clerk, let's mark these items as work complete, please. And if there are no objections, this meeting is adjourned.
We are adjourned.
Thanks all.
Thank you.